Zander by B.T. Bard. Part 2 of 3. Chapter 11. Back to Beanland. The boys were prepared for their journey to Beanland. They had discussed their plans once more with Missy, and they were excited to go. Zander's dad was working until 6. Cindy convinced her mom to take her to the movie theater. So far, everything was working out according to plan. While the boys waited for the right time to leave, they played some basketball at Zander's house. Then they had some snacks and played a video game until the house was finally empty. Zander's mom and sister finally got in the car. When the boys saw them drive away, they called Missy, picked up their gear, and went to the backyard. Missy walked over for moral support. She was also curious to see them jump into the portal. Her job was to blow the bubbles. Both Zander and Brian chomped down their 2 handfuls of broccoli. They each drank a tall 8-ounce glass of milk. While Zander was bouncing on the trampoline, his mom pulled back into the driveway. Cindy spotted him when she ran into the house to get the candy she had forgotten. Cindy ran back to the car yelling, "Mom! Mom! Zander is jumping really high on the trampoline! And Miss Rubik is blowing bubbles! You should see how high he's going!" Grace thought Cindy was being precocious and instructed her to wait in the car. When Grace walked to the backyard, Brian was bouncing fairly high. Missy shouted, "Be careful, Brian!" He closed his eyes and leaped into the air. Poof! He vanished into what looked like a hole in the air. Grace could not believe her eyes. She gasped, then stood there, stunned and confused. She questioned, "What? Well, what happened to Brian?" Grace looked around, then called out, "Zander! Where's my son? Where's Zander?" she shouted as she stared at Missy. "Don't worry," Missy said assuringly. "They're going to be okay." While she tried to explain what was going on, the boys were standing in Beanland. "Cool! Wow, everything looks so bright. I feel like I'm in the Emerald City," said Brian. "I know. Wait till later," remarked Zander. "Check out this bush over here. The leaves are orange." "Hey, it's got some funky huge berries on it," Brian claimed. "They are kind of funky, but we better not try them. They could be poisonous. I like the different colors on them." "They have a tie-dyed look," said Zander. Brian agreed. "You're right, they do," he said. Brian then asked, "So which way to the shed, Z?" Zander thought. "Let's see," he commented as he looked around the area. "Hey, look at this," directed Brian. He held up a tattered piece of paper with a purple line on it. "Let me see," Zander said as he took it from Brian. "I know what that is," he said. "You do?" asked Brian. Zander looked around on the ground, found the other half of the paper, and held it together. "Yeah, look," he said. "Hey, a Z. Did you write that?" asked Brian. Zander answered, "Yeah, I hung it on this pointy branch over here to show you which way I was heading the last time." "That was a good idea. I wonder which way it was hanging," commented Brian. They both looked around for a moment, observing the area. Zander pointed to a hill in the distance. "Hey, Bri, look over there, way out in the distance. Do you see what's on top of that hill?" Zander asked excitedly. Brian looked intensely. "It looks like a castle. I remember you telling me about that," Brian replied. Zander explained, "So that's the way we would go toward I headed that way when I saw—" Zander scratched his head and thought for a moment. "I'm trying to remember," he explained as he thought out loud. "When I got here the first time, I was going toward the castle, but then I spotted Telly. I remember following Telly to the big shed, but I think I got all switched around. I'm not really sure how to get to the shed, but it can't be too far from here." We promised your mom we would stick together, so let's try this way first, suggested Zander. All right, agreed Brian, shrugging his shoulders. As they walked along, they heard a strange propelling sound. That sounds like a twirly-bird, exclaimed Zander. They looked up and around. Sure enough, they saw it. They watched as it grabbed onto the bottom of a nearby tree and tore a stringy vine from it. Then it propelled up the tree, tearing away the vine from the trunk along the way. They noticed that the twirly-bird was simply playing. They watched it hanging and swinging from the end of the vine. Pushing off with its feet, it circled around the trunk of the tree like a tetherball. At the end of the ride, it propelled away from it. Then it grabbed hold of the vine again and repeated the fun. The boys chuckled, which frightened the twirly-bird. Then it flew out of sight. "Whoa!" Brian shouted as he jumped. "What?" asked Zander. "Something just sprang up from the ground and hit my hand. It felt like a rock," explained Brian. "Yeah, right," doubted Zander. "It must have been a rock," he added sarcastically, "because we all know how rocks can jump." Then they both started getting pelted from little things springing up from the ground. Both boys were hopping around in a frenzy, trying to avoid the jumping rocks. "One's in my hair," screamed Zander as he swatted himself and shook his head to get it out. They found refuge on a large mound as they watched these things from the ground jumping like popcorn. As the things eventually bounced away, the boys looked confusedly at each other. "That was strange," said Zander. "What was that?" asked Brian as he tried to catch his breath. "Beats me," said Zander. "Maybe they were crickets," suggested Brian. "I don't know what they were, and I don't care. Let's just try to get to the shed," suggested Zander. "I'm with you," agreed Brian. "Let's go this way," suggested Zander. "Oh, wait a minute," he said. "I remember this green tree. I think this is celery. I have a feeling that we're very close." "Zander, look. Is that a clearing?" asked Brian. "It looks like it. Let's go see," replied Zander. "Come on," Zander motioned with his arm. When they got to the clearing, they didn't see the shed. Zander instructed, "I think we should walk along the edge here and follow the border." Brian followed Zander for about 10 minutes. They were relieved when they saw a large flat surface in the nearby distance. It resembled what looked like the side of a building. "I think we found it," said Zander. "And it also looks like we just went in sort of a circle." Brian groaned, but he was relieved. He sighed and said, "At least we found it." It was the enormous shed. They checked it out briefly and sat down inside to rest. "This is so cool," commented Brian. He gazed up at a stool. "This is huge. I could live under here. It just needs some walls." "It could be my house in a house," he said. Zander laughed and then thought of a witty comment as he pointed at the fireplace. "Okay," he said, "and I'll build a floor up there going across, and it can be my fireplace loft apartment." "I like it," said Brian as he chuckled. Then Brian got a serious look on his face. "What?" asked Zander. Brian wondered. "Maybe we can get Telly that way." Zander looked puzzled. "What way?" he asked. "Well, what if we could build a fire and get smoke to go up the chimney? I bet one of the summoneers might notice it," suggested Brian. "Yeah, that's a great idea," Zander agreed excitedly. Then he added, "Hey, maybe Speck or one of the Caws will see the smoke." "Maybe. Let's give it a try," said Brian. "Okay, except," Zander thought, "how are we going to start the fire?" Brian began searching through his backpack. "With this," he said. "Oh, that's right. I remember you said you had it covered. How does it work?" questioned Zander. Brian explained, "It's a flintstone. I got it from my Gramps when I joined the Cub Scouts. He showed me how to use it once. My mom really didn't want me to have it because I was only 6 years old, but Gramps said he had one when he was a Boy Scout and wanted me to have one for camping trips too. It's like a survival tool for when you don't have matches. I just have to scrape these two pieces together to make a spark." "That is so cool!" exclaimed Zander. Then he added, "I'm going to look for some branches to burn. I'll be right back." "Okay," said Brian. "I think I'm going to crack some of those big straw pieces from that broom over there. That should make some good kindling," he explained. "Good idea. I'll be right back," said Zander. Zander returned with big armfuls of branches that he found in a wooded area nearby. Brian began striking the flint stone. It eventually made a spark that caught the broom straw on fire, but the boys noticed that the smoke was just drifting around in the shed. "We have to make the smoke go up the chimney," suggested Zander. "I think the fire needs to be up on something higher. This fireplace is so humongous. If I stood in it, I wouldn't even reach the opening," he said. "Yeah," Brian said, "and we'll need to make it on something that won't burn, too." They decided to look around for something metal or stone. At first, Brian thought that they could try making a fire on a lot of dirt, but they weren't sure about that. They looked around for quite a while. Zander thought they could pile a bunch of stones at the bottom of the fireplace. Brian thought it was a good idea, but was afraid that the rocks might crack and snap sparks from them. He had seen that happen before. They continued looking around inside and outside. "All right, we aren't having any luck," agreed Brian. Zander spotted a squash. "I bet I could cut a bowl shape out of that squash skin. We could try to make a fire in it," he recommended. "That's a good idea," Brian remarked. "Except it might be too damp to stay lit. Plus, it's super tough to cut through. You know, if we do get a fire going, we can make thick smoke by putting a layer of leaves on it." "Definitely, Bri. Nice thinking," Zander complimented. "And how can we get the smoke directed high enough to go up the chimney?" he asked. "The stool seat is the perfect height," Brian observed, "but it's way too high for us." "Yeah, it's dangerous," Zander added. "True," Brian said with disappointment. They both sat against the wall of the shed, feeling defeated. Within 5 minutes, Brian jumped up with encouragement. "We don't need the fireplace," insisted Brian. "Let's clear an area outside right down to the dirt. We'll put some big rocks around it to make a fire ring, and we'll get a nice smoky fire going. What was I thinking? We can do this," he said excitedly. "Come on, Z, let's do it," instructed Brian. Zander said, "Of course, what were we thinking?" They busily got to work and fulfilled their plan. They made a good-sized fire, then kept adding small amounts of large leaves on top of it to create smoke. The smoke drifted up and over the leafy vegetation. It was only burning for about 10 minutes when they got lucky. "Hey!" they heard a voice say. It was Dabble. Little did they know that the summoner had spoken with Speck. It flew down closer to the boys. "You look like small specks," said Dabble. "Oh, excellent! A summoner!" said Zander with excitement. Brian reaffirmed, "Hello there. Did you say something about Speck?" Dabble answered, "Hello to you, small speck. My name is Dabble." "You do know Speck, don't you?" asked Zander. Yep, answered Dabble. "Well, do you know where he is or which way he was headed?" Brian asked excitedly. "Sure. He was going to the crater to speak with Surma," Dabble answered. The summoner continued, "But that was probably 2 purple times ago, because I remember warning him about the zappers." "Zappers?" questioned Brian. "Yeah, the flying light critters that come out during purple time," responded Dabble. "Cool," remarked Brian. "Not cool, hot. If they fly into you, you can burn," explained Dabble. "Definitely not cool, Zander," replied Brian with some nervousness. Zander remembered out loud. "Oh yeah, I remember Telly talking about zappers." Dabble asked, "Your name is Zander?" "Uh-huh," answered Zander. "I think Speck must have mentioned your name," Dabble said. "I have 2 important questions to ask you. Well, maybe 3, said Zander. "I'll try to answer them if I can," replied Dabble. "My first question is, do you know Telly?" Dabble answered, "Yes, I do." "Great," said Zander. "And my next question is, in which direction and how far is the crater from here?" "I know that it is that way," answered the summoneer as it lifted its wing to point toward a patch of googooberries. "But I'm not sure how far it would be by way of walking. I can probably fly there before the end of green time," Dabble explained. "Okay, well, my third question is really more of a favor," said Zander. He requested, "I was hoping that you might be willing to find Speck to let him know that Brian and I are going to be waiting for him at the huge shed." Yep. First I will see if he is at the crater," agreed Dabble. "And if I see Telly, shall I tell him that you are here?" asked Dabble. "Yes, most definitely. Thank you so much, Dabble," said Zander. "Yes, thank you, Dabble. We really appreciate your help," said Brian. Yep. I will try," said Dabble before flying off. Wait! Shouted Zander. Dabble heard Zander and flew back. "I'm sorry, Dabble. It's just that we really need to return to our home tomorrow around green time, and in order to do that, we need the assistance of Surma," explained Zander. "I understand. I will tell Surma," said Dabble. "And if for some reason you cannot get any messages to anyone, would you mind telling us so that we know what our situation is?" asked Brian. Dabble could sense the boy's urgency and said, "I will be back here during blue time. If you are not here when I return, I will twist a stem around the door handle. Then you will know I came back." "Okay," Zander said. "Thank you," said Brian as he nodded his head. Yep. Bye for now," said Dabble. "Goodbye, Dabble," Brian said. "Bye, thanks again," Zander said as he waved. Zander remembered that Telly told him how delicious googooberries were, so they walked over to try some. They agreed with Telly and found them most extraordinary. They were purple with tiny red speckles, and they were about the size of small cherry tomatoes. They looked bumpy on the outside, and they had the texture of jelly inside. The best part about googooberries was the flavor. They tasted like a combination of bubblegum and grape juice. They indulged themselves for a while, explored around the perimeter of the shed, and then tried to keep occupied while they waited. Chapter 12. Reuniting. While the boys kept busy near the shed, Speck was busy gathering information from 2 Caws named Dex and Lindy. Out of the few hundred Caws inhabitants, Dex was one of the oldest Caws, and Dex knew almost everything there was to know about Beanland. Lindy was Dex's daughter, and she knew a great deal of information about the various species of Beanland. Speck recorded their conversation while enjoying the lovely samples of appetizers he was served. He, like Zander, felt very welcomed by the Caws. During his visit, Dex gave Speck a fairly informative tour of the crater. He was fascinated with the many innovative mechanical devices that the Caws had engineered to make their lives conducive to living in the crater. He was amazed by the simple yet sophisticated assembly of the elevator. Pulleys, cranks, and gears operated it, powered by the hands-on maneuvering of the Caws. As complicated but primitive as the elevator seemed, Speck could not believe his eyes when he saw a unique type of solar-powered generator nearby. He took many notes and drew several diagrams. Another impressive feature involved the distribution of water. Gravity played a very important role in the circulation process. The way water channels traveled throughout the crater provided a constant flow of clean water. Especially impressive to the scientist were the channels that were carved right into the rock wall ledges around the perimeter. Drinking water was always accessible, and offshoots provided areas to clean objects and such. The cause had a unique way of preserving and storing food for themselves. Some involved cold rock shelves and pressurized containers. Speck observed how grains were stored when Lindy insisted on making him a bowl of oatmeal. Lindy walked over to a barrel made of stone and lifted a thin metal lid to obtain a scoop of oatmeal. Another thing that intrigued Speck was the unique sleeping apparatus that the cause slept on. It reminded him of an inversion table. The cot-like sling was attached to the rock face of the crater. A strip of cushion instead of a pillow provided a neck rest. It had a way of tilting, which was explained to be a healthy way to keep the vertebrae in alignment, to allow ample blood circulation, and to avoid getting congested. Dex told Speck that a peaceful and sound sleep was just as important to them as their awake time. After the tour, he sat down with Surma and Ziron to discuss the metaphysical, scientific, and spiritualistic understandings of the cause. He also had a few more questions about the Zappers and the Summoneers, both of which he was very curious about. It was during this conversation that Dabble had suddenly appeared to deliver the boy's message. Speck was surprised to hear that Zander and Brian had transported over. When he found out that it was turning into blue time, he realized that being in the crater caused him to lose track of time. The Summoneer mentioned that the boys requested the assistance of Surma in order to return home. Ziron had a stern look about him, yet permitted Surma to help them all through the portal at the beginning of orange time. Speck was very grateful for their time, information, and hospitality. He asked to be escorted to the shed. Dabble consented to be his guide. He finished his conversation rather quickly in order to meet up with the boys before purple time. He bid them all a fond farewell and followed Dabble out of the crater to begin his trek. Meanwhile, Zander and Brian had been exploring Beanland. They rummaged around the enormous shed. They tasted scrapings from giant carrots, and they sat by a waterfall. When they saw a bush rustling nearby, Zander called out, "Hello! Hello! Is anybody here?" Just then, Telly flew up, out, and above their heads. "Zander?" the Summoneer inquired. "Telly!" Zander said with excitement. Yep, it is nice to see you. And you brought a friend," said Telly. "Yes, this is Brian," he replied. "So nice to meet you, Brian. I must deliver a message, but I will return quickly. Will you wait here?" asked Telly. "Yes, we are waiting here for someone. Dabble agreed to look for our friend Speck. Dabble is also bringing a message to Surma for us. We are hoping to return home tomorrow," explained Zander. "Did Dabble tell you that we were here, Telly?" asked Brian. Yep, Telly answered with a laugh, and then explained, "This is why I am here. I stopped to eat dilly seeds, then I heard Zander's hello." Telly giggled. Zander asked, "What are dilly seeds?" "Oh, they are on a bush over there. Come this way and try some," insisted Telly. "Okay," agreed Zander. The boys liked the dilly seeds. Zander laughed a little. "What's so funny?" Brian asked with a chuckle. Zander answered, "I don't know." Then he giggled again. "I think these seeds are making us laugh," he surmised. They decided to eat more to see if he was right. It was true. And they had a laugh riot of a time. Their laughter was making each other laugh more. Meanwhile, Telly delivered the message and had returned to hang out with the boys for a little while. Telly explained about the zappers that fly during purple time. "I must be home before purple time. You must be in the shed to be safe." Brian nudged Zander to ask Telly a question about something they had seen. When Zander asked Telly about a scorch mark they had found on the outside of the shed, Telly looked at it for a moment. Then the summoner explained that the mark was clearly burned there by a zapper that flew too closely to the building. "I can stay briefly. Let us relax at the waterfall and share some stories," suggested Telly. "That would be great," said Brian. Not only did they share stories, but the boys also shared some of the snacks they had brought. Telly enjoyed the granola bar and the chocolate-covered raisins, but the fruit strips were Telly's favorite. Speck was halfway to the shed by this time. He had slowed down a little, but Dabble kept encouraging a mindful pace. "We will get to the shed before purple time, Speck, but I need to get home before the colors change." "Just try to keep going. We should be there in just a little while," encouraged Dabble. Speck replied, "I understand, Dabble. I'm just feeling low on energy, but I will try to keep up." Then Dabble said, "I might have a solution. Just keep heading straight along these bula trees. They are ones with long orange and pink feathery leaves. I will be back in a moment." A short time later, Dabble met up with Speck and returned with cocoa pods. Remarkably, Speck did feel a little zing of energy. He enjoyed the flavor also. It didn't taste like the cocoa back home. It kind of tasted more like butterscotch or caramel to him. But it was sweet, tasty, and energizing. Speck was able to keep a pep in his step after that. When Speck arrived at the shed, the boys were ecstatic to see him. He was pretty happy to see them also. Speck was curious and asked, "Does anyone back home know you are here?" "Yes, my mom knows. Only my mom," answered Brian. "Oh, good," Speck commented. "We didn't expect to see you so soon," said Zander. Speck replied, "Well, I guess news travels fast around here, thanks to our friends." Brian was anxious to show Speck the scorch mark on the outside of the shed. This made them all more conscientious of the fact that purple time was coming soon. With the understanding that Dabble and Telly needed to leave, they all said their goodbyes. The summoneers were glad to have each other's company for their trip home. Speck and the boys thanked the summoneers and reminded them to be careful. Then they took off. Brian suggested, "Well, we should probably get settled for our sleepover." Speck replied, "I agree. I'm not interested in experiencing zappers. Why don't we gather some bedding materials and get the shed situated for rest?" "Okay," said Zander. Brian arranged straw-like bundles to lie on, while Speck and Zander gathered some large leaves to use as covers. After feeling prepared for their stay, the three of them made themselves comfortable and shared stories before falling asleep. Chapter 13. Going Home. They woke up near the end of red time, which made everything look strange, like being in the center of a sunrise. Zander went out to get some goo-goo berries. Speck cut off a chunk of giant potato to cook up, while Brian got a fire going. The boys had found some sort of metal cap the day before, so they decided to cook the potato pieces in it. They all enjoyed breakfast. Then the boys cleaned the area while Speck collected a few more samples. Surma, Murph, and Zeron arrived at the beginning of orange time, as promised. Brian's eyes opened wide when he saw them. Even though Zander had described them, he couldn't believe how tall the Kaws were. They all said their hellos. Zander introduced Brian. "I am glad to meet you," said Surma. "Same here," replied Brian. "Thanks for coming to help us get back home. I'm sure my mother is nervous and waiting." "Then we should not waste time," said Surma. Zander requested that they sit and talk for a few minutes first. Brian had no objection. He was interested in speaking with the Kaws for a little while also. Just then, Telly and Dabble flew down to make sure that the three guys were doing all right and to wish them a safe trip home. The group happily sat together and chatted for what felt like 15 minutes. Then Surma prepared them for their journey. Zeron reminded the three visitors to remain ultra-quiet about the cause's existence and their land, and requested that they assure him that they would adhere to their promise to be confidants for the sake of everyone's safety. When he asked if anyone had anything from Beanland, they all denied it. When Murph used a gadget to clear the travelers, Speck held his breath because he had tiny samples in plastic containers. Little did they know, the gadget had a malfunction. With happy goodbyes, Surma sprinkled her silver powder, waved her staff, and transported them back home. Missy had been visiting with Grace and Phil, waiting and hoping for the guys to get back safely. It was 12:30 in the afternoon, and she had been waiting in the yard since 7 o'clock in the morning. Fortunately, Cindy had been picked up in the morning by a neighbor to have a play date because Phil and Grace were beside themselves waiting for Zander. They periodically argued about whether or not to call the police. They were upset with Missy for a while. They cried together. They were angry with the boys. Phil and Grace argued about Phil's idea to go through the portal to look for them. Missy apologized several times for not telling Zander's parents about the portal when she first found out. Needless to say, it was a long wait. The various mixed emotions surrounding the situation had everyone's nerves on edge. While Phil and Grace were in the house, Missy witnessed the boys and Speck suddenly rolling onto the ground next to the trampoline. She leaped up from the lawn chair she'd been occupying and stared with wide eyes. After her astonishment, she busted with loud excitement. "They're here!" Grace and Phil ran to the backyard. Speck and the boys slowly got up and brushed themselves off. Phil asked sternly, "What on earth is going on here?" "Zander!" yelled Grace. "What are you doing? Where have you been?" Phil and Grace were angry, but they were relieved that Zander had returned. The boys were silent, so Speck chimed in. "Maybe I should explain." "Maybe," Phil cut in abruptly. "You'd better explain." Before Speck could answer, Phil turned to Zander and with a stern voice questioned, "I can't believe you did this without our permission." Zander answered, "I'm sorry, but I didn't want you to worry." "It's all my fault," Speck interrupted and explained. "I'm sorry." "No, it's my fault," claimed Zander. Brian tried to smooth things over by explaining, "Everything's fine, and we're all okay." Zander added, "Can we just go inside and sit down? I promise, I'll tell you everything." Grace responded, "What in the world have you been up to?" She hugged her son. "Come on, let's go inside. I hope you have a good explanation," she said. Phil walked up to Zander, put his arm around him, and walked with him to the back door. Brian gave his mother a long hug. "Don't worry, he has a good explanation," Brian told Phil and Grace. Speck and Missy smiled and rolled their eyes. Then Missy gave Speck a big hug. They each sighed and then snickered with a slight laugh. "How are you, Speck?" asked Missy. "Just terrific," he replied with a look of complete exhilaration on his face. After having quite an adventure, the three portal travelers felt happy to be back in Manorville, USA. They were all excited to share stories about their trip to Beanland. The three worrisome parents were feeling relieved to see that everyone had safely returned home. They all walked inside and sat around the kitchen table. Speck and Brian allowed Zander to talk about what had happened. Zander didn't get into too many details, but he explained enough to keep certain elements about Beanland confidential while telling enough to satisfy his parents. Phil and Grace sat there with serious eyebrows and worry lines, which encouraged Zander to be as honest as he could. His parents sat there with speculative looks on their faces, while the nearly incomprehensible explanation unfolded. Missy listened also, but more so felt relieved that they were all back. Luckily, Cindy wasn't home. Everyone agreed that she would not be privileged to any information regarding the events that had transpired. Shortly after their conversation, Phil called his neighbor and asked her to bring Cindy home. Then Brian, Missy, and Speck left. Cindy arrived with lots of energy. Although Grace was getting supper ready and her mind was elsewhere, she acknowledged her daughter. "Hi, honey. Did you have a good time?" "Yes," said Cindy, "and I want to go there tomorrow. Annie has the best dollhouse ever and—" Grace interrupted. "Okay, Cindy. You can tell me all about it after you wash up for supper." "Okay, Mommy," agreed Cindy. Just then Zander walked into the kitchen. "Zander!" Cindy shouted with exuberance. She lunged at Zander and jumped into his arms to give him a big hug. "I'm so glad you're home. I love you, Zander," she expressed with genuine sincerity. Grace's heart filled with joy at the sight of Zander's smile. Reciprocating his sister's love, he replied, "Me too." Cindy caught a glimpse of the backyard and became upset. "What is Daddy doing? Why is he taking apart our trampoline?" she cried loudly near Zander's head. The ringing in his ear caused him to make an odd facial expression. Then he rubbed his ear and stepped away from Cindy. "Calm down, sweetie," said Grace, and she thought quickly for a reasonable answer. "Daddy found a crack in one of the bars that holds the trampoline together, and it is too unsafe right now to jump on. So the company told us to take it apart until they can find us a new piece to replace it with," she explained. "Oh, but we're not getting rid of it, right?" asked Cindy. Grace answered, "Oh, no, we wouldn't do that." Grace didn't want to tell her they planned to get rid of it. She didn't have the energy for one of Cindy's fits. "Come on, go upstairs, wash up, and bring down your laundry too," instructed Grace. Cindy sulked as she walked up the stairs with a slouch. "Good one, Mom," said Zander. Zander wasn't too upset about getting rid of the trampoline. After all, his parents were fairly lenient about his punishment. For the next month, he was expected to do more chores around the house. Plus, he was banned from sleepovers at Brian's house. Due punishment, he figured. There was a lot of intensity in the air, especially after Cindy had gone upstairs. While Phil was busy dismantling the main leg supports of the trampoline to prevent further portal transports, Zander and Grace heard a strange thumping sound, followed by a piercing scream. Cindy's shrill 7-year-old voice alarmed the household of a major problem. Then she slammed the bathroom door, bolted down the stairs, and grabbed a hold of her mother. Grace responded frantically. "What? What happened? What is it, Cindy?" Phil heard the scream and ran into the house in an instant. "What happened?" he asked, gasping for a breath. Cindy was clearly shaken up. "I don't know! I don't know!" she finally answered. "You don't know what?" asked Phil. "It's something. It jumped up," Cindy stammered. "Calm down now," Grace said. "What jumped, honey?" asked Phil. "I don't know what it was, Daddy. I was looking at Zander's backpack," she began. "You're not supposed to be in my room," shouted Zander. "Quiet, Zander," yelled his father. "I wasn't in your room, Zander," shouted Cindy. "You left your backpack in the bathroom." Phil insisted. "Tell us, Cindy, what did you find?" Just then, they all heard a series of thumping noises coming from upstairs. "I don't know," Cindy cried. "It just popped up out of Zander's bag, and I couldn't see what it was. It scared me, Mommy." "Popped? Like a popper? It can't be," Zander whispered to himself. "Zander, go see what it is," instructed his father. "But be careful." The thumping noises sporadically continued. "Okay," Zander answered. "No, wait. "I'll go too," said Phil. They walked up to the bathroom door, knowing it was small enough to fit into his backpack, and hearing the strange sounds of both a slide flute and a muffled buzz coming from the bathroom. Zander had terrific clues as to what it was. Even though he'd never seen one, these were the sounds he heard while he and Brian were getting hit by things jumping from the ground. Phil whispered, "That sounds odd." Zander slowly opened the door a crack to peek inside. "Be careful," warned Phil. Zander saw what was thumping and quickly closed the door. "What did you see?" asked his dad. "It might be a popper," said Zander. "What's a popper?" asked Phil. Zander reluctantly answered, "It's from Beanland." Phil replied with a long sigh and said tiredly, "Oh no, Zander." Phil placed his hands over his eyes and shook his head in despair. Zander didn't know what to say. He just shrugged his shoulders and responded remorsefully, "Sorry." Chapter 14. Popper Problem. Unbeknownst to him, Zander had returned with a living souvenir. He had deduced that the popper wasn't very dangerous or aggressive. However, it was definitely out of its element. He could not help but wonder how it had mysteriously traveled back with him in his backpack. But he had to put that question aside for the moment. His main priority was trying to catch it. Zander armed himself with a baseball mitt. "I'll get it, Dad," he exclaimed. Not giving it a great amount of thought, he hurried into the bathroom and quickly shut the door behind him. Zander was immediately ducking and weaving, trying to avoid the rapid pinball-like bouncing and haphazard flinging of the popper. It was clearly out of sorts and extra excited. He sensed the critter's distress because it was also spinning around on the slippery floor while making humming sounds. The popper would do this for mere seconds. Then it would abruptly take off and dart around the bathroom like popcorn popping. He explained, "You see, poppers were little ground tillers. In Beanland, they would spin themselves around and drill into the soil. Then they would blast back up, popping through the ground to break up the soil." Zander figured that's what it was trying to do in the bathroom, simply a natural activity in an unfamiliar place. Meanwhile, his family began frantically rushing around their home, trying to figure out what to do about the popper. Phil, Zander's dad, instructed him to find a way to escape the bathroom while leaving the critter inside. "I don't think I should leave, Dad. It might get out." "Then it would be all over the house," explained Zander. "How big is it?" Phil asked anxiously. "I guess it's about the size of a hamster, but it's too fast." He sounded somewhat frantic. "I can't catch it." His voice wavered. His speech was choppy as he was ducking and weaving in the small space, trying to avoid getting black and blue. "I need something," Zander yelled. "Be right back," his dad replied. Phil bolted down to the garage. Little Cindy heard many bizarre noises coming from the bathroom. She stood motionless at the bottom of the stairs. She heard the shower curtain abruptly opening and closing. She was both excited and nervous. Cindy wanted to go upstairs, anxious to get a good glimpse of the critter, but she tried her best to stay out of the way. Zander gasped each time he hopped out of the way. At one point, the popper bounced in and out of his baseball mitt so rapidly that it was impossible to catch. Besides, Zander didn't want to squash the little thing. The popper knocked over the rinse cup, which made quite a clatter as it tumbled around inside the sink. Zander flung towels at the walls and at the door, trying to keep the popper at bay. He did not want to hurt it, but he thought that getting a towel over it might stop it long enough for him to grab it. The popper squealed, buzzed, and boinged before making a sudden move downward and smashing into the wastebasket. This startled Zander, so he shouted and jumped into the tub to protect himself with the shower curtain. Hearing her brother's scream, Cindy shrieked, then yelled out, "Mommy!" Grace instructed Cindy to find her bicycle helmet to protect her head in case the popper got loose. So Cindy began throwing sneakers every which way in the coat closet as she frantically looked around for her helmet. Meanwhile, Grace rustled through the cupboards. Cooking pots crashed to the floor as she tried to find a good size to put on her own head. In good time, craniums were protected. Both girls armed themselves with spatulas and serving spoons. Then they sat on the floor behind the sofa and tried to figure out what was going on based on what they heard. Meanwhile, Phil rushed to the garage to find something that could safely contain the popper. He rustled around through bins and large boxes, searching for something that could both trap and carry the critter. After a lot of fast digging and chucking a variety of sports equipment and holiday decorations all over the garage, he felt that he had found the perfect items. He grabbed an old bucket from the camping equipment and spotted Cindy's butterfly net hanging on the wall. Just as Phil got back upstairs, Zander suddenly jumped out of the bathroom, landed on the hallway floor, and abruptly kicked the door shut behind him. He was panting and sweaty. Phil held up the net and bucket to capture and contain the popper. Zander was speculative about the net possibly being too frail to catch the popper, stating that its ability to blast through dirt might show no match whatsoever for a butterfly net. Phil asked him to think for a moment about anything that might help their situation. In no time, Zander exclaimed, "Yes! Speck might be able to help. He's probably still at Brian's house." He hopped to his feet. "I'll run down and call over there real quick." He turned toward his dad. "You better not do anything crazy, Dad. Just let it settle down for a few minutes," suggested Zander. Phil replied, "Good thinking. Go. Call. Do it." Zander charged down the stairs as his dad shouted behind him, "And have him come over right away." Phil listened from outside the bathroom for a few moments. Either the popper had already knocked everything over, it was injured, or it had begun to relax now that it was alone. It was still buzzing and bouncing around in short dashes, it seemed, sounding like a combination of a dying housefly and a slinky. It did not sound as panicked as it had, so Phil went downstairs to speak with the family. He called for Grace and Cindy and explained that the popper was contained in the bathroom for the moment. He chuckled softly when he saw their headgear, but remarked, "Hey, you two had a good idea." They were relieved and walked around the sofa. "Daddy, I'm scared," said Cindy as she put her arms around him. I know," he replied with a comforting pat. "What is that popper thing?" asked Grace. "I'm not sure. It might be some kind of a bug or a frog. I don't really know," answered Phil. "But hopefully Zander will have some answers for us." Just then they heard Zander in the kitchen. "Great. Thanks a lot. See you soon," Zander said before he hung up the phone. As he quickly entered the living room, he sensed that his family was waiting anxiously to find out what was going on and how this all happened. Speck was still next door. "He's on his way over," said Zander. His mother asked, "So, can you please tell us about this thing in our bathroom that has turned our household upside down?" "Yeah, sure, Mom," replied Zander. "But could you just wait until we get it caught in something safe first?" Zander hurried upstairs, pulled down the attic ladder, and called, "Dad!" As Phil ran upstairs, the doorbell rang. Grace opened the door and directed Speck to go upstairs. Zander had remembered that they had an old cat carrier in the attic. Luckily, he found it rather easily and handed it down to his father. Although Speck questioned the size of the popper compared to the size of the gaps in the cage door, Zander felt confident that it would work. Speck suggested, "I would go in and try to get it, but I'm actually wondering if Zander should do it. Since it is most familiar with you, maybe it will be more responsive." Zander rolled his eyes, then bravely took the carrier from his father and went back into the bathroom. Zander stepped into the bathtub and slowly closed the curtain. The popper bounced off the mirror, then began bouncing next to the door. Try to be slow and calm. Animals seem to respond better to that, Speck offered as he spoke closely to the door. Zander breathed for a moment, then thought about turning the carrier upright to give the popper more bounce space. He slowly propped it somewhat behind the creature and onto the floor. Shortly after, the popper bounced in, but it didn't stay long enough for Zander to close the cage door. A few more minutes of waiting, Zander was lucky enough to capture the popper. "I got it!" he boasted. He left the bathroom with the carrier inside. Speck took over from there. He examined the specimen for a good hour, taking notes and drawing sketches. Meanwhile, Grace gave Cindy a bag of snacks and walked her to the basement playroom to watch one of her favorite movies, so she and Phil could speak with Zander about what they should do about the popper. Zander was not wavering about his desire and responsibility to return it to Beanland. "How much of the trampoline did you take apart?" he asked his father. "Well, I got 3 of the legs somewhat disconnected." Grace began ranting with a quivering voice. "I am not having my son risk his life to return some popper thing to some other dimension because he feels responsible for some weird creature that stupidly bounced into his backpack. I do not want him to go back there again, and—" Phil grabbed Grace calmly. "Okay, honey, I know how you feel. Why don't you make us all a nice cup of tea? I'll discuss it with Speck and we'll figure it out, okay? How does that sound? Are you better now?" Phil's voice had a reassuring tone. Grace shrugged. "Yeah, I'm better. I'm just—" Phil shushed her and slowly walked her into the kitchen. I know, he calmly repeated. They continued talking in the kitchen. Phil insisted. "So, Zander, your mother and I feel strongly about our need to know more about the place you went to. We also want to know about the portal, how you felt jumping through that. And please tell us more about the landscape you saw and the creatures you met. We also want to know—" Whoa, hold up, Dad. I'll be happy to tell you more about it. Just let's tackle one question at a time, okay?" replied Zander. The teenager spent the following 20 minutes spewing as many details as he could remember about Beanland, careful not to divulge too much. He answered all of his parents' questions, hoping to gain their confidence about allowing him to make another return trip. While all of this was unfolding at Zander's house, Brian and his mom were making a salad together. Missy had also been asking her son a slew of questions about his journey to Beanland, and he was willingly describing as much as he could remember. Although they were curious about Speck going over to Zander's, neither mother nor son wanted to get involved with that. For the moment, they were happy to remain content together in their peaceful home. Brian took the macaroni and cheese out of the oven. Then the two sat down and continued talking about their experiences and feelings regarding the past few days. Brian felt badly about the stress he had caused his mother. Not only had she tried to keep Zander's parents calm about the boys traveling through a portal, she also had to keep herself relaxed about her own worries about their safety. Nonetheless, Missy expressed how proud she was of her son for being a good friend to Zander by accompanying him to an unknown place and for checking on Speck in Beanland. Even though it was early in the evening, Brian was exhausted. He sat at the table with his mom, but all he wanted to do was lie down on his bed and maybe play a video game on his tablet. In the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder why Speck ran over to Zander's house. "I think I'm going to sleep well tonight, Mom. I'm wiped out." Brian bowed his head and closed his eyes. Missy acknowledged how he felt, but she insisted that Brian needed to take a shower after dinner. Soon after, Brian walked upstairs, turned on the shower, and then went to his mom's desk to grab the phone. When he called Zander's, Grace answered. They had a brief conversation about the popper. Brian was surprised that it was able to transport back with them. Grace asked, "What do you know about this popper thing?" Brian explained that they can bounce high and they look kind of smooth and camouflaged in the ground when they're at rest, sort of like a potato partially under the soil. He added, when they bolt around, they look fluffy, and they have these little springy-looking big bird kind of feet. When Grace asked how dangerous they are, Brian answered, "I don't think they bite or scratch, but I got a few little bruises when we walked through a nest of them in Beanland. They move fast." Brian reassured Grace that she shouldn't be too worried, and he added, "You'll probably find it real cute when you see it. They remind me of those pencils with the fluffy things on top that puff out when you spin it between your hands." While Grace thanked Brian for his input, he heard Phil yell in the background, "Grace, can you bring me an eyedropper and a small glass of water?" Although things were out of sorts at Zander's house, they were contained. The carrier holding the popper had been taken into the garage to give it some peace and quiet. Many questions circled around the popper. How did it get into Zander's backpack? Did it carry any diseases? Would it live through the night in this world? Should they bring it to a veterinarian? What does it eat? Will it go to sleep soon? What on earth were they going to do about this adorable critter? Zander felt a terrible amount of pressure. After all, it was mostly his fault that the critter was there. Speck suggested that, for the popper's own health purposes, it would survive best in its own habitat. Zander sighed with grief and explained that that was not an option because the trampoline was not together, and his parents forbade further portal travels. Speck understood Zander's parents' concerns surrounding the dangerous elements of a young man traveling on his own. He also understood the overprotectiveness that a parent must feel after hearing of such phenomenal adventures. So Speck offered to help fix the trampoline and return the popper to Beanland. Zander's parents were all for it. However, Zander was reluctant about having the scientist poking around in Beanland again, especially by himself. He knew that the cause wanted their home to be kept off the radar. They cherished their peaceful existence. Zander became bossy. "There is no way that I'm going to let you go over there without me," he began. "You won't be able to return the popper without collecting samples and taking pictures. I know it." Speck was taken aback, as were Zander's parents. Grace remarked, "Zander, you do not have a say in this right now. The adults will decide." Zander had rarely gone against his mother's wishes, but he felt he had no choice at that moment. His dander was up, like a wolf protecting its young. "I will not allow one more adult to bash through what is not rightfully theirs, to do what they wish, to take what is not theirs, to cause distress where there is peace," he claimed. "This is my quest, this is my duty," he ranted, "and I will do what is necessary to right the wrong that I have committed and face any consequences there might be. I have to," he insisted. Zander's father smiled and nodded with pride. His mother, although surprised by his tone, was suddenly aware that her little boy was becoming a man. Speck exhaled and replied, "Well, Zander, it seems like—" He turned toward Grace and Phil. "Maybe I'll just be at Missy's for a little longer. Call if you need me." He tilted his head in a thankful and understanding way before he left. While Zander's emotions were getting the best of him, Cindy snuck in the garage to get a better look at the popper. She noticed its yellow fuzzy fur. When Cindy heard Speck go out the front door, she called out, "Mommy, come and look! It's so cute! It has feet like Big Bird." Grace gasped and looked at Phil. Phil shot a concerned look at Zander. Zander was the first one to get to the garage. "Cindy, don't touch it!" he yelled. "I'm not, Zander," she retorted. Then Cindy asked, "Why does it smell like minty soap?" Grace and Phil exhaled with relief that the popper was still contained in the carrier. Grace laughed slightly. "I bet the toothpaste and hand soap it knocked into in the bathroom has something to do with it," she said. The popper stood motionless while staring up at the four of them. Grace added, "It is cute. The poor thing looks nervous and scared. Can we feed it something?" Phil replied, "It seemed to like the water I gave it with the eyedropper, but I'm not sure what it would eat." Zander added, "I'm pretty sure it eats dilly seeds, which I'm sure we have none of." "Is it anything like dill?" Grace asked. Zander got his backpack and started emptying it. "Hold on a minute." He had remembered gathering some seeds while trekking around and putting them in his empty granola bag. He discovered that there were only a few left in the plastic bag. The popper must have gotten into them. Zander found a small amount that must have spilled out at the very bottom of his backpack. When he showed his mom what they looked like, the popper began buzzing and springing on its feet. "I think it wants some," Cindy remarked. Zander dropped some in the carrier, and the popper ate them up. Phil went into Cindy's room and began looking through her dollhouse for cups and dishes, hoping to find something that would hold water for the creature to drink out of and was small enough to fit through the carrier cage. Unfortunately, he could not find anything that would work. Grace remembered recently getting an odd free gift in the mail that she didn't have much use for. She went to the kitchen and brought back a collapsible rubber dish. Zander was able to squeeze it through an opening in the carrier. When the bowl sprung open, the popper jumped back and was briefly frightened. It appeared more content after it drank some fresh water that was squirted into the dish with a baster. Zander and his family admired it for a few minutes. Then they decided to sit down in the kitchen to discuss the situation at hand. Grace began, "So I'm thinking that we should bring it to the vet." "Are you kidding, Mom? No way! That would cause havoc." "Do you realize—" Zander was quieted when his father touched his arm and shook his head. Phil agreed. "You're right, Zander. I think that would create problems." "Well, we can't take care of it, and we can't let it die," explained Grace. Cindy began tearing up. "Oh, no," she expressed while putting her forearm over her eyes. Grace moved closer to her. "Don't worry, sweetie. We won't let anything happen to the popper." Zander spoke up. "Well, I think I should go back and return it. That's the right thing to do." "Go back where? Can I go too?" Cindy asked. All three of them answered her together with a definitive "No." Phil sensed the intensity rising. "You know what?" he interjected calmly. "I think your mother and I need to discuss this by ourselves for a little bit. Please, both of you go upstairs. Please. Get ready for bed and let us see if we can figure this out." As he was leaving the kitchen, Zander commented, "That's fine. Just remember, its life is in your hands." Chapter 15. Returning to Beanland. After their discussion, Phil asked Zander to join them in the kitchen. "I hope I'm taking it back," said Zander. After an intense conversation, Phil and Grace had decided that Zander would return the popper to Beanland under a few conditions, the main one being that Phil would go with him. They also had to stick together during their journey. Zander sighed with relief, then group hugged his parents and said a sincere thank you. Then he helped his parents straighten up the garage. Before leaving the popper there for the night, Zander had an idea. Rather than putting a red string of Christmas lights away, he plugged them in for the popper. He hoped that the red glow might be a comfort to it, as a reminder of its home. Zander slept fairly well and was up at dawn. He went for a peaceful walk around his neighborhood and thought about his life. On his way back home, as he was walking by Brian's house, he was surprised to see his buddy sitting on the front steps playing a handheld video game. Brian was equally surprised to see Zander up and about so early. When Zander walked over and told him about going back to Beanland to return the popper, Brian was excited. They spoke briefly, and as soon as Zander left, Brian ran in the house to tell his mom about the news. He was so charged up that he woke her with an excited voice as he ran through the kitchen. Missy's eyes were barely open. She shuffled out of her bedroom while cinching her robe. "Good morning, sweetheart," Missy kissed Brian's temple. "What's all the excitement about, Brian?" she asked. As Missy walked toward the kitchen, he blurted out Zander's news. She pushed her hair away from her face, sat down on a stool, and tiredly requested that Brian boil some water for tea. "You gotta call Speck," he requested. He grabbed the phone, handed it to his mother, and then put water in the kettle. Although Missy felt it was too early in the morning, she phoned Speck. He became equally excited about the news, then asked to come over. Missy shook her head as if trying to awaken herself more. She yawned, then replied, "Sure, just give me a half hour to get myself together." At the Harmons' house, Grace had arranged for Cindy to visit with her grandparents for a few days. After all, it was summer vacation, and Cindy loved getting special attention there. She also loved doing crafts and going shopping with her grandma. Although Cindy knew that her brother and father were going to return the popper, she didn't know anything about a portal transport or Beanland. She simply assumed that they had to return the popper far away, and that thinking was fine with her parents. Being 7, she typically made up strange stories that sounded like the cartoons that she watched. However, to be on the safe side, her parents asked her not to tell anyone about the popper. Her silence would be rewarded with a certain stuffed bear that she had been asking to make at a specialty store for the past year. She was happy to oblige. After Cindy left for her visit, several discussions were had, especially since Speck, Missy, and Brian had decided to join Zander and Phil. There were arguments, challenges, logic, and questions to be considered and explained. Phil's goal was to keep an eye on Zander. Speck wanted to explore for scientific purposes. Brian wanted to support his best friend again. Missy wanted to look after Brian. Zander wanted to return the popper and make sure that Beanland was not disturbed by everyone's visit. Everyone but Grace decided to go. All considered, many preparations were made during the rest of the day. Grace was not thrilled about the idea of being left alone with her worries and thoughts, so they all agreed that if certain circumstances arose where nobody returned by a certain time and day, Grace would have a game plan to contact particular authorities, including the scientific community and law enforcement. She also consented to take care of Brian's many pets while they were away. That involved a dog, an iguana, a cat, a fish, and a turtle. The guys made sure the trampoline was in good shape to be used the following day. While Zander was looking over the emergency first aid kit the next morning, he heard the doorbell. A moment later, he heard Brian's voice among the chatter of familiar grown-ups. They were 15 minutes early. There was excitement in the air. Grace and Missy were talking quietly in the living room, while Brian and Speck stood in the backyard discussing the trip they were about to embark on. Brian was pacing and talking, his arms widespread, waving all around as he described his last trip through the portal. When Phil announced that he was ready, Grace sighed. "Please make sure you look out for one another." By this time, everyone had gathered in the kitchen. Grace hugged Zander and gazed lovingly at Phil. Zander rolled his eyes. "We will, Mom." Then Phil reassured her, "Don't worry, honey. We'll stick together, and I won't let anything happen to Zander." Grace hugged Phil tightly and gave him a couple of kisses on his cheek and lips. "Be quick," she requested, then smiled. "I'll see you later today," Grace reminded them all. Everyone reassured Grace that they would be extra careful and take good care of each other. Then Zander and Brian went to the refrigerator to get the milk and broccoli. Grace blew bubbles outside to encourage everyone's feelings of lightness. One by one, each adventurer ate their handful of broccoli and drank their required glass of milk, and one by one they each bounced at least 4 feet high on the trampoline and disappeared into thin air. With each disappearance, Grace quietly gasped and said a nearly silent prayer for each of them. As they arrived on the other side, in another dimension or on another planet, they still weren't quite sure. It was a rougher landing than expected. Speck landed on his rear end. Brian took some backward steps as he spun around. Missy made a forward stumbling jog and fell right into the arms of Speck. She laughed nervously as she thanked Speck and looked around. "Are we there, Brian? Are we in Beanland?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, this definitely looks like it." He paused as he looked around with concern. "But where's Zander and his dad?" The three began looking around nearby and calling out their names. However, they soon realized that the two were not there. In another area of Beanland, father and son wondered where the others were. Since they were the first to transport there, and they both wound up in the same place, they were very curious. What was taking the others so long? Had they chickened out and stayed in Manorville? Were they okay? Did they transport somewhere else? They waited for a few minutes, then decided that the popper needed to be freed. Zander unzipped his backpack, slowly opened the plastic breathable container that Speck had given him, and carefully slid the tired-looking popper out of the box. The popper suddenly perked up when it recognized where it was. Then it bounced off into the brush. "Well, that's that," Phil remarked. "Do you think it's going to be all right, Dad?" "Yeah, sure. It'll find its way, Zander. You did the right thing." Phil paused and smiled. "I'm proud of you." "You're kind. And brave." "Thanks, Dad." Zander felt good. He nodded as he looked toward the ground. Phil felt good also. As he began to pay more attention to his surroundings, Phil commented on the weird lighting, the odd plant growth, and the fragrant smell. It was yellow time, so it was almost like looking through sunglasses. There were thorny bushes around. Goo-goo berries wafted through the gentle breeze, creating a fruit punch-like fragrance in the air. Zander introduced the berries to his dad, and the two enjoyed a small snack while they searched nearby for the others. "You know, Dad, it looks like we entered in a different spot than I have before. The other times the portal took me to an area close to a giant shed. Maybe that's where the others are." "Do you know where we are, Zander?" The boy twisted his lips and raised his eyebrows. "Not really." Zander occasionally looked up and around, hoping to spot a summoner. He knew one would be helpful. After all, they are messengers, so they certainly know their way around. After waiting and meandering around for about 15 minutes, Phil said, "Let's just assume that they are here in Beanland somewhere. We need to figure out exactly where we are. We need to find the others, and we need to get to the crater." "Okay, Dad," Zander agreed, but deep down he felt concerned and responsible for the others. Well, I think I hear rushing water in the distance. Let's go that way, Zander pointed. He was hoping to find a familiar waterfall which might give him a sense of direction. That way it is, agreed Phil. Before heading off, Zander told his dad about certain things to look out for. Not wanting to upset his mother, he had waited until this moment to tell his father about the following hazards. First, he pointed out the sharp spikes on the thorn bushes. He also warned his father about the poppers, reminding him that they till the ground throughout the land. He explained about how, at first glance, they appear to be rocks blasting upward through the soil. He also explained that if they sense any weight or movement above ground, they usually wait for the passerby to move. With this in mind, they decided to walk with heavy footsteps. Another caution that he told his dad about was the imposing tank beetles that slowly meander and do periodic drilling. As the two began their walk, he told his dad about some of his experiences with the sticky pink swamps and how they can be as hazardous as quicksand. Along their trek, Phil was amazed by the sight of the enormous broccoli plants and the wide magenta trunks of the beets. They had been walking and discussing their observations along the way. However, they were both surprised by what they came upon during the rocky terrain they were hiking. The ground ahead of them appeared to be covered in leaves the size of rooms in a house. Phil was reluctant to walk across them. However, he still preferred to take the lead. Even though he walked cautiously, it wasn't long before he slid on a water puddle. It felt as slippery as ice. Phil couldn't stop himself from twisting and flailing about, and eventually he landed on the rough, bumpy ground. Zander surprised himself when he belted out a laugh. But he knew that in all seriousness, they could not afford to be injured while so far from home. Phil got up and rubbed his gluteus maximus. Upon further discussion, they decided that they should go around what seemed to be a gigantic pumpkin patch. They continued toward the sound of water. Incredibly, Zander recalled the surroundings by the waterfall from his first visit. It was there that Phil inquired more seriously about the odd lighting in Beanland. With that, Zander remembered one of the worst dangers of all. He immediately filled his dad in on what he understood about time in Beanland based on the color changes that lit the land. Zander explained, "I know we have no plans of being here for very long, but at the end of the day, Beanland goes into purple time. During that time, everyone is aware of zappers. They are critters that burst through the air super fast, like a spark, and they can actually burn you if you come in contact with one." Just then they both jumped back and ducked as they saw something quickly swooping toward them. "Zander!" screeched Telly. "Telly!" Zander was excited to see his friend, and he was happy to introduce Telly to his father. They asked the summoneer to keep an eye out for the others. They talked only briefly because Telly was in the process of making a delivery. Telly pointed out the correct direction to the crater, assured them that they would meet at the crater a little later to talk more, and then quickly flew off. Phil was shocked by Telly's appearance. "Was that thing half bird and half human?" he asked. Zander kind of shrugged and nodded, indicating a fair acknowledgement. "Telly has a cute little face, and definitely tiny human feet," Phil surmised and continued, "but his body definitely looks like a bird." "Telly is not a he or a she, Dad," Zander corrected. Phil looked puzzled. "Then what is it?" "I guess you can call it gender neutral. Telly is a summoneer. There are many of them," said Zander. Phil had a look of disbelief as he cocked his head to one side and raised his eyebrows as if to say, "Seriously?" In response, Zander raised his eyebrows as he widened his eyes, giving his dad the impression that they were far from home and in another land far from Earth. Chapter 16. Rescue Scene. As father and son walked together, they commented on the strange variety of vegetation they saw. Then suddenly, without warning, Zander fell through a hole in the ground. After a long and curvy ride sliding through an air chamber, the boy landed inside a cave underground. He was covered in cool mud. When he tried to wipe it from his clothes, it just smeared. He tried to get it out of his hair by running his hands through it, but it only slicked his hair down. As Zander glanced around, noticing he had landed in a dark, rocky cave, he felt dread. His eyes became squinted, and his lips pursed. The view of his surroundings appeared desolate and uninhabitable. He heard only wind whirring and some dripping water in the unseen distance. He sensed that the cave was a lot larger than he could see, which made him fearful. Zander felt his nervous belly churn and his heartbeat race. His mind was in a frenzy as he yelled up the chute. "Help! Dad! Help me! Are you there?" He paused for 10 seconds. "Dad! Do you hear me?" Zander blurted. He made a whimpering sigh. "Oh, man! Now what am I going to do?" he mumbled. Meanwhile, Speck, Missy, and Brian had entered Beanland near the waterfall that was not too far from Caw's crater. Soon after their arrival, Ziron was told of their presence. He sent a few Caws to greet them. One of them recognized Speck. After learning who they were and why they were there, they invited the 3 adventurers to follow them to the crater. Brian was excited. He turned to his mother and said, "Zander and Speck talked about this place. I can't wait to see—" "Shh!" Missy held up her finger. She wanted Brian to stay calm and focused, while Speck motioned with his hand to relax. After a brief meeting with Ziron, the head cause, they all felt quite comfortable. Then each person was brought to a different area in the crater. They could see each other, but they were being shown and taught different things. Missy looked around the kitchen area. Brian handled cute little critters, and Speck examined a variety of contraptions. Ziron was very pleased that the divination he was told about many years in the past was now in the process of being fulfilled. He waited happily for Zander and Phil to join them. In a different area underground, Zander ruled out going back up the slippery, tubular tunnel. Instead, he decided there was only one logical direction to proceed. He went to his left, which was toward a wider, brighter area. He barely got 12 steps in when he began hearing something like a helicopter getting closer. A flock of twirlybirds suddenly flew toward him, creating a wind as they propelled past him overhead. When they noticed Zander, they abruptly stopped. Zander covered his eyes as an amber dust swept around. Luckily, Zander was familiar with twirlybirds and felt a kindness toward them. They looked alike for the most part, each with an elongated face that resembled a rabbit. A few feathery tufts on the tops of their heads, partially smooth-looking bodies, human-like hands, and of course their round, propeller-like tail feathers. One twirly bird made a clicking sound, then bobbed its head. "Hi, my name is Zander. I fell in here by accident." He pointed to the air chamber tunnel and then held his head and shook it from side to side. "And now I'm lost." Unlike the summoneers, twirlybirds did not speak. He dropped to his knees and held out his hands, hoping that the birds understood that he was asking for their help. Now many of the twirlybirds vocalized a series of click-clacks. They slowly started spinning their tails, propelling in the direction that Zander initially intended to walk, which encouraged him to follow. Zander trudged along with a grateful gait. Down the narrow passage, he began to smell the remnants of tank beetle tail-tip shells that had shed and were decaying in the dirt. He held his nose for a short spell until he meandered into the open space ahead. He was relieved to see glimpses of light peeking through from high above. It reminded him of gazing at the stars at night, but he figured it must be small holes letting in light from above ground. The pin-pricks of yellow time glistened through just enough to lighten the mood underground. It gave Zander reassurance that a passage to Beanland above ground could be attainable. He held his hands beside his mouth, tilted his head back, and hoped that his father's ear would catch his voice. "Daddy! I'm under the ground! I think the twirlybirds are going to help me get out. Can you hear me?" The twirlybirds began propelling up and down like ocean waves. He sensed that they wanted him to continue his plight to make contact above ground. "Dad, are you there?" Zander continued, then paused. "Dad!" he repeatedly called out. Along one wall of rocks, Zander heard dripping water splashing into a small, shallow pool. Even though the repetition reminded him of a peaceful percussion sound, because of his predicament, it wore on his nerves like a leaky faucet. He was relieved to get a little drink to cool off and feel refreshed. After all, he was feeling a little sweaty from his earlier panic attack and adrenaline-charged tunnel ride. When he turned the next corner in the cave, Zander was awestruck by the fabulous green-lit waterfall that was trickling from the highest point. Then, before the twirlybirds flew away, they directed him down a long, narrow passageway that began to incline. Zander continued calling out for his father. Meanwhile, Phil had been searching frantically for his son. As soon as he discovered that Zander wasn't behind him, he was determined to find him. Phil nervously looked under and around things while calling out his son's name. He could not understand how the boy had simply vanished. They had been walking so closely together, and he didn't hear Zander make any alarming sounds. Phil decided to regroup his thoughts, slowly retrace his steps, and keep his eyes and ears open for any signs at all. About 10 feet off the path, he noticed large insect-like tracks. Phil was intrigued, yet highly concerned about the thought of his son being attacked and carried off. Then the negative notions began pouring in, as he stood there feeling helpless. What if some kind of magic just zapped him to dust? Maybe something flew down and gobbled him up. Ugh! He became more frustrated with his thoughts. I really know nothing about this place. This was so stupid. Why did I ever agree to let us come here? In a desperate plea, and with a dry, raspy throat, Phil shouted super loudly, "Zander! Where are you?" He waited with wrinkled eyebrows, clenched lips, and held breath. As he stood motionless, a far-off voice was finally captured. Phil gasped at the prospect that it could be Zander. He heard it again, and began seeking it. It sounded like a hollow whisper in a tin can. He stepped slowly and quietly, eventually tracing the noise to a stump. When he looked down, it was completely hollowed out and appeared to go deeply into the ground. He put his ear closer. "Dad!" he heard his son calling. Phil was beside himself. With a nearly shaken voice, Phil took a deep breath and called down, "Zander!" Zander replied with great relief, "Dad, I'm underground." Phil asked, "How can I help you get out? I can't see you. Are you okay?" "I'm all right, Dad. The twirlybirds are with me. But I think I'm stuck in here." Zander began to whine. "I don't know how to get out." "How did you get down there?" Phil questioned. "Maybe you can get out the same way." Zander yelled, "It felt like I fell down a huge rabbit hole or something." "Maybe I should try to find it and come to you," said Phil. "No," Zander opposed. "Please don't. Just call around for Telly." Telly will know what to do. Telly has helped me before. Okay, Zander, I'll try. Just stay calm and stay still for right now, requested Phil. After about 10 minutes of calling out for Telly, Phil heard something getting closer. It sounded like the flapping wings of a hawk. Telly called out, "Here, here! Here, here!" The summoneer landed on a nearby branch. "Telly?" asked Phil. "Yes, I am Telly. I am glad that you called for me," replied the summoneer. "The cause asked me to look for you. Where is Zander?" Phil was somewhat relieved to have some assistance. He explained what had happened to Zander and pointed to the stump. Telly's head bobbed in acknowledgement. Then the creature instructed Phil to wait there for a moment. In the meantime, Zander's eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, and he became curious about the underground area. It seemed to be more excavated than organic, which gave him reason to believe there could be a way out. He felt drawn toward the sound of splashing water. Although he knew that he probably should stay put, the urge to look around was overwhelming. Around a corner he came upon the magical sight of another waterfall. It was flowing down a very narrow part of the cavernous rock wall, and it had a beautiful yellow-green backlight to it. He surmised that the time of day had something to do with the color of this water. It reminded him of a lemon-lime drink that he liked, but he was certain that this was just water. As he walked a little farther and around another corner, he noticed a partially lit tunneled hallway which looked promising. Zander was surprised to see mirrors along the walls, mirrors that were reflecting a soft light. Upon further investigation, Zander noticed a door. His mind began to speculate the possibilities. He thought he had seen those mirrors in the cause crater once. Was he that close? The door might go to the crater. Maybe something evil was behind the door. Or perhaps there was a treasure. There were no signs around. Was it the home of a gnome? Was it a magical room? Was it a tomb? Should he forget the whole thing and get back to the muddy pipe that sent him down in the first place? Even though Zander felt it was wrong, his curiosity and his desire to find a way out got the better of him. His hand slowly turned the knob and pushed open the door. It was very dark and completely silent. Zander decided to use his headlamp. He saw some long stone tables and some seating. To his left there was another door. This one was larger and wooden. He slowly removed the hinged lever and gently pushed the heavy door open. A wall was facing him, but when he turned to his right, he was in awe of the vast space he immediately sensed. The enormity of the room reminded him of shopping with his mother in a superstore or warehouse-type building. There were numerous aisles of shelves which stored many thousands of various samples of substances such as plants, minerals, and tree barks. He also came across bone fragments, dehydrated meats, chemicals, liquid specimens, and cloth-like materials. Zander was flabbergasted, yet highly curious. What was all this for? Why was it in Beanland? And who put this here? He breezed through, quickly scooting up and down the aisles while periodically mesmerized by some of his findings. There were some huge glass fish tank-sized containers, each holding different substances as indicated. Helium-3, uranium, iridium, osmium, gold, hematite, quartz, and copper. In the aisle of bone fragments, Zander came upon some labels of species he did not recognize that were labeled as such. Adamu skull, fell king metacarpals, aeronymph pelvis, strioclamin femur, and reptilominus tailbone. Although he discovered quite a bit, he felt as though he had just scratched the surface in this room. Zander left the room and continued walking through the hallway. Approximately another 200 feet ahead, he found another wooden door. After carefully opening that door, he had an immediate sense of guilt, feeling he had wrongfully trespassed into a forbidden area. A strong aroma of lavender and sage filled his nasal passages and relaxed him. He felt both a sense of shame and a sense of honor as he gazed upon a golden statue of a beautiful bird. It was encircled by happy golden cherubs. Along the perimeter of this enormous space were other statues. They had their own areas of idolizing. Throughout the room, and just askew of each statue, were large 3-foot-high obelisks made of quartz crystal. He saw one small wooden box in front of each of them. Zander wondered if this was a place of worship, as the boxes gave him a sense that they were kneeling blocks. Perhaps this was a museum of statuesque treasures. He thought it was odd that there were no seats in the room. Then Zander began to feel agitated with himself. I should have just stayed where I was and just waited. Why am I so curious? Next, Zander noticed a pattern of colored circles in front of him. They were positioned on the floor and resembled a path. Even though Zander felt he was being intrusive, he briefly meandered around the room on the path, taking in what he could. Beautiful statues towered over him, some marble and some bronze. They were clearly from Greek and Roman times. He also found a crucifix with Jesus Christ, a golden Buddha figurine, 2 12-foot-high stone carvings of Egyptian pharaohs, a leather-bound Koran with gold-embossed letters protected in a glass case, and a statue of a Hindu goddess he had seen a number of times, but of whom he couldn't recall the name. Without warning, Zander heard a commotion of voices heading toward him. The voices didn't sound familiar, and he knew that he was there uninvited, so he abruptly left the room and started to run back from where he had started. Fortunately, no one followed. At the same time, Phil believed he had found the place where Zander had fallen into. He yelled down into the hole, hoping his son would hear him. "Telly went somewhere. I think he has an idea," Phil yelled louder when Zander didn't answer. The boy's father felt a nauseating pit of concern in his stomach because Zander hadn't answered back. Telly quickly returned, whistling for Phil's attention. Phil was instructed to grab the vine that was swinging from Telly's feet. Telly explained that the vine could hold his weight and that they needed to find a place to tie it at the top of the air chamber. Air chamber? What's an air chamber? Phil jerked his head around while scratching it. Is it safe? Telly explained that the chamber was fairly safe and that it went into a cavern. Phil kept a close eye on Telly as the summoner flew around a mound of mossy bushes and beckoned, "Here, here!" Phil couldn't find anything to secure the vine. Telly explained that if they could get one of the caws or a tank beetle to hold one end of the vine, it would allow Phil to be lowered down. Then he could retrieve his son, and they could both be pulled up and out of the slippery chute. Without delay, Telly quickly flew away for assistance. Phil just couldn't sit still and wait while his son was lost. After some creative thinking, Phil managed to find a thick, gnarly trunk lying nearby. Phil carried it back to the air chamber opening. "Zander!" he called out again. Zander still didn't answer. Phil was hoping for Zander's reply. If he was down the chute, Phil thought he could try to pull him out. Since that didn't seem like an option at the moment, he chose to tie the vine around the trunk, prop the trunk near the hole, then throw the vine down. His plan was to have the trunk secure itself across the top of the hole, which would allow him to shimmy down the chute. This would also allow him and his son to climb back up the chute. After Phil descended about a third of the way down, he heard something snap. Unfortunately, the trunk could not support his weight. As Zander arrived back at the air chamber, he heard a long, drawn-out warning yell. It was his dad. Phil came out of the air chamber, bouncing across the wet dirt floor, looking like a rock skipping on water. The long vine and an enormous chunk of carrot followed behind him. "Oomph!" Phil blurted on his final bounce. Zander knelt near him. "Are you okay, Dad?" Yeah. I just don't know what happened," Phil explained. "I tied the vine super tight to that tree trunk and laid it across the opening of the hole. I thought it was long enough to anchor me, but—" He trailed off as he shook his head. "Sorry, I tried." "I'm so glad to see you." Zander picked up one half of the cracked trunk and commented, "Well, I'm glad you brought food." He cleaned a section of it using the underside of his shirt. Then he took a bite. Phil hesitated to ask, "What is that?" Zander answered, "This, my brave old dad, is part of a gigantic carrot, which is why it probably wasn't strong enough to hold you." "Wow, that's incredible. Now I know why it's orange," said Phil. Zander held it out to share with his father. "You want a bite?" They both shared an awkward laugh for a moment until they realized that now they were both down in the cavern. "So you never found Telly?" Zander assumed. "Yes, I did. He was going to look for a cause or a tank beetle, whatever they are, to hold this vine, but I guess I was too worried and impatient," Phil admitted. Zander shrugged. "Well, when Telly finds a cause, I'm sure we'll get some help." Thinking he may have heard something, he snapped his head around. Realizing the possibility that he could have been followed, he made a brisk motion. "Quick, Dad! I may have gotten into some trouble. We need to hide somewhere. Hurry!" Suddenly, a half-dozen twirly-birds propelled low near the two. Whoa, what's—" Phil stammered. Zander happily replied, "Twirly-birds, don't worry. They're nice." He felt a sense of ease. "They tried to help me earlier." "They have little human hands," Phil pointed with wonderment. "Look!" The twirly-birds began bobbing and click-clacking again. Zander instructed his dad to follow. As they walked past the waterfall, Phil was amazed by what he was seeing. "Wow! A waterfall underground!" He commented that there must be a stream above ground there. Then they walked through a tight space and around a corner until they came to a cliff with a huge drop-off. Phil said, "Whoa! This is huge under here." "I know, Dad," agreed Zander. "This is awesome. Look how far down it goes," Phil added, then continued. "And look how wide it is. I wouldn't have imagined that this space could be underground. That must go 200 feet down." Some of the twirly-birds propelled down a good 100 feet, while a couple of them hovered close by. Zander and his dad decided to rest, so they sat and waited. They both wondered what was going to happen next, and they looked at each other with comforting relief to be together. As Phil put his arm around Zander's shoulder, he apologized for allowing them to go to Beanland. Zander replied, "I love being on this adventure with you, even though we're stuck in here." "Don't worry, Dad. I feel really safe here for some reason," Zander reassured Phil. "Ho ho, yeah," Phil mockingly chuckled. "I also feel super safe hanging out at the top of a huge canyon with nowhere to go, all while something could be hunting us." Zander laughed. "I didn't mean, just, you'll see what I mean." "I hope so, Zander," Phil said as he raised his eyebrows, leaned back, and sighed. "There isn't much else we can do right now," he added. While they waited, Phil and Zander expressed how they missed Grace and Cindy and shared stories about funny experiences they've had together. Phil asked his son to tell him more about the psychic at the fair. He listened carefully as Zander told him about her odd behavior, the peculiar riddles, and her bizarre comments. They both realized that it had probably been months since they had hung out and talked together. It felt like a nice bonding time. Phil touched Zander's arm. "We need to do this more often, don't you think?" Zander smiled and nodded. "Except, let's make it above ground from now on." Phil partially chuckled, and patted Zander's arm. He asked, "By the way, you weren't down here too long. How did you get into trouble, and what was after you?" Before Zander could answer, they heard a purring of tiny propellers in the distance. As the noise began getting closer and louder, they saw the flock of twirly birds rising back up from the deep canyon. The two waiting joined them, and Phil and Zander rose to their feet. While a large number of twirly birds hovered there, Phil asked, "What do we do now?" Zander replied, "Hold up, one's coming closer. I think it's holding a piece of paper." Zander took the paper and read this message. "Go to the air chamber. Surma will help you out." He explained, "I'm sure that's the place we both fell through." Phil relayed with conviction, "Yes, it is." He gave a sigh of relief, then comically commanded, "To the mud chute, son!" Zander chuckled, delighted by his dad's light-heartedness. They both thanked the twirly birds while bowing their heads. Then they watched the flock slowly descend more than 100 feet back down. Eventually, they all disappeared through a hole in the side of the canyon. When Zander and Phil arrived back at the air chamber, they found a note hanging down through the chute, along with a device that looked like an anchor and pulley combination. The note instructed them to rig the device with the rope that would be making its way down the chute. Help was there. Surma had 4 other caws with her at the top. They managed to safely pull the father and son above ground. Unfortunately, the rescue left the 2 humans covered in mud from head to toe. On the plus side, they were relieved and appreciative. Each of the caws got big hugs from Zander and Phil. Zander smiled when he saw the surprised expression on his dad's face as Phil's head pressed against the furry chest of the caws. It looked like he was being hugged by an oversized teddy bear. Surma explained that they could get cleaned up at the crater. "Great! Is Brian there?" asked Zander. "Yes, the boy is there along with the 2 older humans," replied Surma. "You're gonna love the dryer, Dad," remarked Zander. "Let's go then," Phil said with a weary sigh. Surma was not in a hurry to get to the crater. There was some important business to discuss first. She asked the travelers why they were in Beanland, even though Speck had already explained about the popper going home with Zander through the portal and about the obligation Zander felt to bring it back. Surma questioned everything she could with regard to the returned popper. "Please let me know anything else that you can about the popper and its experience with you," she asked of Zander and Phil. She appreciated their cooperation. It was critical to know about the popper getting a little toothpaste and soap on it. It was also important to know about the granola and water intake. Zander looked worried. "Will the popper be okay, Surma?" he asked. "Well, that is what we need to know," she said. "Zeron will want to send a couple of twirly birds and a summoneer to go to the area where you released the popper to scan the general proximity with an overhead detector, which will check for any contaminants," she explained. Phil remarked, "This is awful. We probably should have left it on Earth." "No," said Surma. Then she added, "It may have gotten very ill or worse. It could have gotten you or others ill. Foreign germs are not always easy to understand or get rid of. That is why it is good that you were able to give me clear directions to the place where you arrived." "Well, Surma," Phil replied, "thank you for being so understanding." "Yes, really," added Zander. "I am so sorry that the popper was accidentally taken to Manorville, and I really hope nothing bad happens. I am very sorry. I feel awful." Surma accepted his sincere apology. She told them that they would try to find the popper and assess the area. Surma instructed a fellow cause to inform the Flying Scan Committee to do their job. Then she continued to lead Zander and Phil to the crater. At one point, Phil reached into his backpack and grabbed a bag of lollipops to share. The cause were very grateful and truly enjoyed the sugary treat. A couple of them even discussed the possibility of trying to make goo-goo berry lollipops sometime. Chapter 17. The Crater. Through some discussion, Zander was relieved to find out that the voices he had heard underground earlier were 3 Caws. Surma said that when Zeron suspected that Zander could be in that area, he sent a few of them to search for him. During the trek to the crater, everyone's energy lifted. Zander even taught the Caws a couple of songs. They especially enjoyed learning Colors of the Rainbow. The Caws' entourage were fascinated to hear about the earthly times of day. Phil felt reluctant about going to the crater, especially after spending some unpleasant time underground. However, he couldn't help but wonder what it was going to be like. Zander expressed his concern about their friends, but Surma reassured them that Brian, Missy, and Speck were safe and sound at the crater. This gave Zander and Phil feelings of great relief, and they expressed their gratitude to the cause for helping them out. Surma had to halt their journey briefly when they heard a pair of tank beetles coming their way. Although they are not creatures out to harm, tank beetles have enormous and heavy bodies, which tend to scrape against things that are in their path without much thought. They all walked to the top of a nearby watermelon to stay clear. Up there, Zander realized why he had fallen into the pink swamp during his first visit. As they stood there, they watched one of the tank beetles scrape a spiky part of its armor against the watermelon, carving through the rind. This sliced an opening for pink juice to seep out. The watermelon slightly jostled from the strike, but they were all able to keep their balance without slipping down. Before they continued on, they took advantage of slurping a fresh drink of slushy pink sweetness. Along their walk, Zander pointed out other interesting things to his dad that he remembered during his first visit to Beanland. Beside the sporadic fields of giant vegetable crops here and there, Zander showed him where Frosting Hill was in the distance. This was the name he had given a tasty mound of creamy sugar. The cause agreed that it was a good treat, then explained that it was the result of an overflow of pollination that is collected and deposited when the fetchers review the flowers during green time every day. Phil and Zander didn't quite understand, yet they didn't bother to ask questions about it. Although they never came upon it, Zander excitedly told his dad all about the things he had seen in the shed that once belonged to a giant, and how he and Brian spent an interesting night there on their own. Other things that fascinated Phil during their trek were seeing poppers in action, seeing the feathery tufts on the bula trees, noticing that what looked like an alignment of rocks was actually a crop of potatoes, and experiencing a crop of giant lettuce that became a maze to navigate through. He felt like a child who was learning things for the first time. A short time later, Phil was happy to find out that they were at the crater. He didn't see a big hole in the ground, which is what he expected. Instead, he followed the cause and his son into an opening in the ground. There was a very small flag posted at the entrance. They all walked along smooth, rocky stairs that curved down toward a rather small waiting area. Two Caws escorted them to a small alcove that had a hole at the top. They instructed Phil and Zander to stay in their places to be water-soaked. The enormous shower plunge took care of most of the mud. The water wasn't very cold. Then they were positioned to stand under and in front of enormous fans. In a minute or less, they were completely air-dried and feeling cleaner and more alert. As they waited for the elevator, Zander had a permanent smile. He was reminiscent about his first visit to the crater. Phil was curious about the cranks he heard in the distance, which sounded like the muffled noises from a factory. As soon as he had the chance, he asked the Caws some questions about the sounds, which the Caws was happy to explain. Most of the sounds were mechanical in nature and familiar to Phil. Some descriptions involved terms he was simply unfamiliar with. While riding down the open platform elevator, Zander looked around with more awareness than before. When they stepped off the elevator, Zander zoned in on the many mirrors hanging high on the stone walls surrounding them. When he asked Murph about the mirrors, the Caws simply explained that they were used to refract more light in the dimly lit space. The look on Phil's face as he stood there watching the Caws work the water wheel gears and buckets reminded Zander that his dad was once a kid like him. In fact, Zander realized that perhaps he shouldn't think of people as their current age, but rather as a combination of every age leading up to their current age. In that moment, he understood that his grandmother, at age 66, could actually know how it feels to be 3, and 12, and 26, and 33, and 44, and 57. In fact, she would be made up of all those ages, all the way up to 64. It gave him a new respect for people older than himself. He understood that he could see them as being the same age as him. His grandma, at his age, still existed somewhere within herself. She can relate with him. He placed his arm on his dad's shoulder and nudged him to follow the Caws. Along their walk through the crater, Zander took special notice. Something about a conversation he had had with Telly resonated within him, making him more intrigued by the crater this time. Being extra observant, Zander spotted petroglyphs along the cave-like walls in the distance. They appeared to extend down a hallway or tunnel. Although he was curious, he was anxious to see Brian and the others. So he remained quiet and kept walking. Zander would have to wait a little longer to see his friend, because Zeron was waiting nearby to greet them. He wanted to speak with them about the air chamber before they went any farther, so Phil told him what had happened. When he was finished, he felt the need to ask Zeron a question. "I've been wondering about something, and since Surma wasn't able to really answer it for me, I thought you might be able to." Zeron appeared obliging, so Phil asked, "Where exactly are we? Are we in another dimension, on a different plane, in outer space? Where?" Zeron paused, then looked seriously and calmly at Phil. He smiled and answered, "We are in Beanland. I know that you come from Earth, and that is a planet, but all I can tell you is that we exist in Beanland. This is our home. This is where we live." Phil realized a clear answer wasn't going to be revealed, so he let it go. Then Zeron expressed an interest in speaking with Zander privately. Since Zander was willing, Phil did not say no. Zeron simply told the boy that he was aware of his exploration underground and would appreciate Zander's discretion to keep his experience to himself. Zander was glad he was not reprimanded, and he respectfully agreed to not say a word to anyone about the fascinating relics, icons, and specimens he had observed. Zeron thanked him, then they walked back to Phil. As they got closer to the communal area, Phil told Zander that he sensed a combination of smells that reminded him of the sleepaway youth camp he attended during his early teens. It smelled earthy from the must, with a hint of stirred-up lake water, a small dose of wet dog fur, and the wafting aroma from a busy mess hall. Zander and Phil both inhaled through their noses for a moment to experience the smells together. Zander added that the food smelled like a combination of chicken soup, tomato sauce, and chocolate-covered cherries. At the same time, they both suddenly felt hungry. Then they looked at each other and, at the same time, as if rehearsed, raised their eyebrows and rubbed their bellies. They laughed at the similarities of their mannerisms, then continued following the cause. As they rounded a corner, they saw Speck, Missy, and Brian waiting to greet them. The 5 adventurers were excited to see each other and share their experiences. Zander immediately asked Brian, "So, where were you? It's so weird that we wound up in 2 different places this time." Brian said, "I know. We arrived pretty close to the crater, and we've been in here almost the whole time." Zander was also happy to see his friend Telly, and he thanked the helpful summoner for playing a role in his air chamber rescue. Zander asked the others to wait for him in the communal area while he had a brief discussion with Telly in private. They consented. "Don't be long, Zander," instructed Phil. "I'm keeping an eye on you." Zander pointed to an area not too far from the others and replied, "I'm just sitting over there. I'll be right back." While relaxing in an alcove with Telly and munching on sweet, juicy goo-goo berries, Zander asked Telly what he knew about the underground tunnels connected to the crater. Telly told him about the air chambers and how they exchanged the good and bad air from the crater. Telly also knew that the water features were used for drinking, bathing, and electricity. Telly conveyed that the cause mined for minerals and used many of them as a commodity. When Zander asked about the significance of crystals, Telly assumed that Zander was asking about the crystal pyramid. The summoner asserted that it was an off-limits area only used by the cause, and then further explained that if anything tried to fly directly over it, they were putting themselves at risk of becoming incoherent, dizzy, and pushed away. Zander was shocked to find out about a crystal pyramid and explained that he was inquiring about the crystals underground. Telly did not know about that and looked troubled by the miscommunication. Zander felt he should have kept his mouth shut. Telly tried to change the subject to appease Zander's question by sharing a story about some wayward summoners that had accidentally gotten lost in the crater tunnels. A couple of them had heard a blasting sound down a corridor. They described it as a high-pitched, sizzling sound followed by a rumbling explosion that eventually diminished into silence. Zander expressed his surprise and disbelief, which made him curious. He asked Telly to describe it in greater detail, so the summoner did. The story illustrates that these wayward summoners eventually came upon a large metal-type tube with a pointed front end and a seating compartment. They reported that they secretively watched the cause place the tube on the uppermost end of a track. Then they pushed it with great force, sending it down a long trail where the tube picked up enough speed and gained enough momentum to go upward into what they described as a vortex. When the tube shuttle entered through the vortex, it disappeared. Zander was highly intrigued, but simply replied, "That's an interesting story." Was it similar to his portal travel? He wondered. Was something in the tube? If the vortex transported it, where did it go? The two sat quietly for a few minutes, watching a hubbub of activity. The cause had invited their human guests to feast with them while the preparations were underway. Then Telly said he had to check on something. They agreed to speak more later. After Telly flew away, Zander sat alone and thought for a moment. He imagined what a crystal pyramid would look like. The shuttle and the vortex intrigued him too. His mind started to wander. He began to daydream about places he might travel, places that he could only imagine might exist. Other dimensions, other countries, other planets, other lives in the past and future. The possibilities were endless, and his mind was racing. He was jarred back to the present moment when he heard his dad's voice calling his name. Zander was asked to join the others for the meal, so he respectfully did. He delighted his taste buds for a bit, chatted with some of the cause, and listened to the interesting things that Brian, his mom, and Speck had experienced. Zander could not sit still. He felt pulled as if by a mystical force. There was an adventure to be had. He was determined to see the crater tunnels, so he made a plan. He knew that the air chamber connected to tunnels and the crater connected to tunnels. He also knew that getting into one of these areas could be both difficult and dangerous. With that in mind, Zander decided to make sure that no matter which tunnel he decided to explore, he would be sure to mark his trail. This would not only help him find his way back, but it would also help him to be found, if necessary. He sneakily took a couple of handfuls of goo-goo berries from the table and put them in his pockets. Zander knew that the bright magenta berries stained, so he decided he would smear the berries on the rock walls along his path about every 15 steps. He needed to be inconspicuous about leaving, so he socialized with the others for a little longer. There was a lot of excitement during the feast. There were a great number of caws, a few dozen summoneers, and a handful of twirlybirds. There was also a small group of springy characters that looked like flat-faced dogs that had 2 extra big eyes and 4 arms resembling tentacles. They, like the twirlybirds, did not speak. They all enjoyed each other's company while they feasted on exotic snacks. They ate crunchy bugs with onion dip, watermelon carrot juice served in edible tomato skin pouches, cocoa spread served on flatbread, and breaded corn kernels the size of quarters sprinkled with a mildly hot spice. After a short while, Zander decided to excuse himself. He indicated to his dad that he was going to ask to use a bathroom. His real interest was to walk back to where he noticed the petroglyphs earlier. Zander meandered casually around a pillar aside from the crowd. Then he snuck away, through some rocky passageways until he came to an enormous drop-off. It was much like the one he had seen while lost in the air chamber, except this one looked twice as far down. How far do these vertical channels go, he thought. Feeling a bit uneasy about the depth, Zander decided to back away and keep exploring. He knew he was going against his promise to stick together, but he couldn't help himself. He was especially curious to find the crystal pyramid and the tube shuttle that Telly had told him about. After a few minutes or so of fast-paced walking, he came upon a crossroad. He stood there, torn between going back and venturing on. He couldn't resist continuing. Would he go right or left? The path to the right led toward an upward slope. The path to the left went downhill. After careful consideration, Zander decided to walk upward. The tube shuttle began high, plus downhill would be easier if he got tired on his way back. He strolled along, hoping to come across something fantastic. He was excited about what he might find, and he felt nervous about what he might find, and he felt guilty about what he was doing. His stomach and heart were geared up. After walking an upward slope for about 200 yards, Zander began noticing the natural light beams dimming. He took his headlamp out of his pocket to help him see. He wasn't frightened, but rather intrigued. As he rounded a corner, the beam from his headlamp bounced off what appeared to be mirrors along the rock-faced walls. This helped to light his way, which made him feel as if he could head somewhere worth exploring. Meanwhile, back at the feast, Phil became uptight about his son's disappearance. He knew it had been too long, so he asked Telly to look for Zander. With Zeron's permission, Telly and Dabble went looking for the mischievous teen. First they searched throughout the bathroom corridor. No Zander. They searched as far back as the watermill. No Zander. They flew along the mega cliff. No Zander. Although neither of them had ever flown down the tunnel hallway, and it was a little far from the celebration, Telly had a strong feeling that their friend had gone that way. Some strong signs indicated that Telly and Dabble were on the right path. Lizard frillers were working through the corridors. They looked as though they had fin-like fans located from the back of their heads to around both sides. Their job was to flap their frills in order to blow dirt and dust from the surfaces of the walls and floors. One area was still quite dusty. It was obvious that they had skipped a section on the wall. Ahead they appeared to be moving slower than usual. The Summoneers wondered if something or someone had frightened them. A little farther ahead, the Summoneers also noticed a small fragment of a wrapper, which was not something of their land. After flying quickly through the cavernous hallway, they came upon the crossroad. Unsure of whether to proceed up to the right or down to the left, they decided to split their search, promising to meet back at that spot by the time they reached the end of humming a lengthy tune that they both knew. With that, Telly headed up the path on the right, and Dabble started down the path to the left. A short distance ahead, Telly saw a magenta-colored circle smeared on the wall. It was obviously made from goo-goo berries. Telly felt sure he was on Zander's trail. By this time, Zander encountered a couple of small rooms. In one room, he smelled sulfur, which did not appeal to him whatsoever, so he just opened and closed the door. One room had acquired a large amount of glowing bugs, which seemed to react with agitation when Zander went inside. Their twinkling display looked magical, but he quickly left. He continued down a darker corridor. A large cluster of snakes were moving together along the walls. After some had inadvertently landed on his shoulder, Zander screeched as he flicked them off. Then he ran to the nearest room. About 10 seconds after he closed the door behind him, he was shocked by a blaring alarm-like noise that nearly deafened him. At this point, he was certain that he would be severely punished for poking his nose where it wasn't allowed. Zander tried to bolt through the door to leave. However, he was suddenly startled by the floor moving beneath his feet. In an instant, the floor opened up. It was a trapdoor to capture intruders. Why? What was in that room? As his body fell through the air in the complete darkness, his stomach felt as if it were up in his throat. Zander was not only petrified for his life while he fell for what seemed like forever, but he was also immensely sorry for what he had done. In his heart of hearts, he swore that if he survived this fall through the unpredictable blackness, he would never again snoop around. He felt sorry about not getting permission to be there. During this incident, Telly saw a blue flashing light in the distance and heard an alarm. It was clear to the Summoneer that getting out of there as soon as possible was imperative. Telly stopped humming and flew briskly back to the crossroad. When Dabble got there, they went back to the party. Eventually, after a long, terrifying 2 minutes of what felt like falling, Zander opened his eyes to discover that Zeron and Surma were observing him through a thick, dark glass wall. Even though he had indeed fallen for a moment, he was now in an anti-gravity chamber where he floated for some time. The chamber had a regulator that indicated Zander's state of remorse. It swiftly read his genuine sincerity, which allowed him to be released. Even though Zander trespassed in a private location without permission, the cause were impressed by the depth of his remorse and sincerity. Based on the regulator, Zander was truly one of a kind. Zeron sensed that the prophecy he knew about appeared to be coming true. Zander sat in what seemed like a soundproof room for what felt like a long 15 minutes. It was there that Zeron, the head cause, spoke to Zander about something he referred to as the divination. This had to do with Zander's capabilities to make positive world changes. The boy listened intently to Zeron, but didn't know how to respond, so he remained quiet. Zander was shocked by this information. All of the signs point to you, Zander. He felt so overwhelmed by the enormous responsibility it entailed. He felt as if he was in a daze. Zeron allowed him to have a moment to be introspective. How could that be? I'm nobody special. Zander asked if he was sure that he was the right person. Zeron confirmed this was so with unwavering certainty. Zeron was not going to let the incident stand in the way of the celebratory plans, so they walked back to the communal area. Zander was soon reunited with his dad and friends. Seeing the look of disappointment on his father's face made him feel deep regret. The embarrassment of his trespassing in the crater created a lump in his stomach. It took a while for him to feel comfortable enough to make eye contact with anyone. However, knowing that the cause had forgiven him and moved on eventually helped Zander to feel better about his wrongful actions, which made it easier to forgive himself. Zander was quite contemplative throughout the remainder of the celebration. After a short time, and to honor the prophecy, Zander was given an extra special permission to have a brief guided exploration with Murph. Phil's instincts were to absolutely prohibit letting Zander do anything more without him. He insisted, "I promised your mother we would not separate." Then Phil became quiet. Nothing seemed or sounded like hypnosis, but there was a deep sense that everything would be all right. Zeron was logical and spiritually convincing, promising Zander's safe return before the end of Blue Time. Although the travelers expressed an urgency to go home, Surma promised they would be leaving fairly soon. While Zander went with Murph, Phil and the others were given a tour of their own within the crater. It gave them a really good idea about the lifestyle of the cause. As for the other beings, they continued feasting and enjoying themselves. Some twirly birds spun their propellers against something that sounded like a brush snare drum, while others tapped tubes with glass rods. An 8-part summoneer choir hummed in a mesmerizing and mystic way, while keeping an upbeat melody. The springy dog group seemed to dance in the most peculiar and funny way imaginable, with their tentacle-like arms flailing every which way. They were a happy and entertaining bunch. Chapter 18. Permission to Explore. The Crystal Cave was a place that only Cause had ever been allowed to enter. Zander would soon be surprised to be escorted to the sacred area. He reassured his father and the Cause that he would not leave Murph's side at any time. Zander was instructed to wear a blindfold during part of their trek, which he willingly consented to. After being led by Murph for what felt like 15 minutes, he was told to remove the blindfold. He found himself standing next to a track. Beside him was a wooden platform with a large basket adhered to it. Zander was instructed to sit in the basket. Murph stood beside him on the platform with wheels. Then Murph pushed the pole he was holding against the ground in order to move them along on the track. The smell of the basket and the damp tunnel reminded Zander of his grandpa's rowboat, which brought back fond memories of fishing and helping with the anchor. Zander saw glimpses of interesting drawings on the rock walls along the way. One looked like a caterpillar, another was a funny-looking giraffe, and then there were symbols that looked like curly sevens or upside-down twos. He asked Murph to stop momentarily to look at what appeared to possibly be a language. There were circles with lines through them, some curvy, others straight. Dots were also incorporated. Zander asked Murph what it all meant. Murph explained simply that star beings recorded history and laws with pictorial documentation when they arrived long before the cause settled there. Unfortunately, he couldn't explain what the symbols meant. The wheels on the track continued clacking with a rhythmic tempo down the dimly lit, rocky tunnel, and the smells of sage and lavender were becoming stronger. The water trickling down the tunnel walls and into small puddles sounded another beat. They rolled closer to a lit opening ahead. When they finally reached the entrance to the crystal cave, Zander was awestruck and felt a great sense of privilege. "Is this really happening?" he thought. He couldn't wait to see the crystals up close. He was even more excited than the time he had his favorite friends join him at the circus to celebrate his 8th birthday. His mind was an open box of curiosity, and his heart raced. Zander knew he was getting closer to experiencing a magical wonder. He felt that his purpose was to be right there at that moment, which felt very special. Murph explained that many Kaws come to the crystals during their awake time to gain strength, spiritual connectedness, and peace. Their primary intentions are to offer prayers for others. They offer their wishes and blessings, and they praise a being of light. Many humans would categorize that light as God, but the Kaws call the light love. During their prayers, they give thanks to love and return their love to the light being in order to keep its glow and spirit alive for all eternity. At last, Murph stopped the platform. They were standing at the entrance to the crystal cave room. Zander's excitement changed into an awed spiritual awakening as he couldn't help staring at a symbol above the door. He felt a strong memory linked back to the psychic. The symbol appeared to be the exact same design he had seen on the earrings that Madame Lightly was wearing during Zander's psychic reading at the fair. Inside an egg shape was an upside-down triangle that connected to a teardrop shape. In the center of the teardrop was a small circle. Slowly he passed through the door and entered the room. He saw reflections of an orange-yellow glowing light and refractions of bent light. He experienced a sense of bliss, knowing he would probably see this once-in-a-lifetime sight of wonder for the first and only time. His inner desire drew him to observe 2 Kaws kneeling and humming in an area. Special lighting made their fur appear purple. He wanted to join them, but Zander didn't know what to say and didn't want to be disruptive. He resolved to simply hum with them, ever so softly, and stood still beside Murph. The 2 Kaws on their knees were facing a large mirror that was reflecting an enormous crystal plate that was balanced on its side. In a drone-like fashion, the Kaws began repeating a chant known as SEIM. They were saying, "Strength for the soul, strength for the mind, energy for creativity, energy for continuity, intuition to gain insight, intuition to believe, motivation to complete mastery, motivation to grow." Zander was enchanted by their tone and peaceful focus of intent. He felt hopeful, and he was inspired by their phrases and by feeling that they actually were providing positive influences with their meditative chanting. He was inspired to send his own positive intentions their way. In doing so, he felt an awareness of personal growth from his mild participation. He sensed a feeling of self-actualization and a realization of being fully present and at one with his life, and he knew that he would use this instance as a memory to aid him in his life. As Zander stood in awe of the crystals, Murph knelt near a crystal base that had a most unusual symbolic statue graced upon it. Murph motioned for Zander to kneel beside him. Then the Kaws told the boy that Zeron had permitted him to share his intuitive skills with the boy. Zander appreciatively soaked in what he was told and shown. It entailed breathing, clearing his mind, and opening a receptive channel flow in his consciousness. Although he focused on the lesson, he saw that the statue he was kneeling in front of resembled a bird perched on the center of a propeller. Under the propeller was a large sphere, which, to Zander, looked like the planet Earth. After a short meditation, he became aware of a crystal stairway, which was somewhat camouflaged by the mirrors, lights, and crystals throughout. Zander and Murph didn't walk up the stairway during their trek back out of the cave, but still Zander asked Murph about it. Murph explained that there was a crystal pyramid above ground. Zander wondered if the stairs led to it. Murph answered, partially. When he asked if anyone could go to the pyramid, Murph was surprised and taken aback by the question because he knew how sacred the pyramid was considered by the cause. Even so, Murph kindly explained that the crystal pyramid was a spiritual sanctuary and a transcendental energy arena that was protected by an electrified field around a moat perimeter. Additionally, Murph was aware that only cause beings had been permitted to enter the pyramid, which he kindly mentioned to Zander. He also reminded the boy of the remarkable privilege he had already been given. Zander agreed and thanked Murph. Although Zander was extremely intrigued, he respected the off-limits message. He expressed how wonderful it sounded, then left further inquiries alone. His imagination was full of wonderment as he tried to envision what a crystal pyramid might look like and how one might feel from it. He brought his mind back to the fascinating crystal cave. He daydreamed about its mirrored reflections and bouncing prisms of rainbows, its soothing smells, and its slightly cool temperature. He knew his mind would be able to go back there whenever he wanted to because he had really soaked it in. This gave him a remarkable sense of honor. Zander recalled that Madame Lightly had told him he would have a new outlook, a new vision. After experiencing the crystals and seeing sacred icons throughout the cave, Zander felt more globally and universally connected somehow. He felt an inner change, an awareness, a knowingness, and a personal responsibility to change life somehow for the better. Chapter 19. A Farewell Celebration. Back with the others, the crater was full of chatter and excitement as bowls and platters were passed without formality around the rock platform table. There was a very large crowd present, including more summoneers and twirlybirds than before. Everyone was engaged in conversation, wondering what Zeron would do for the ceremony. Speck seemed more somber than the others. He was anxiously awaiting answers to the flurry of questions that bombarded his mind. Secretly, he really wanted to stay behind and explore and study the fascinating environment and newly discovered species, but deep down he knew that if he would ever be welcomed back, he needed to stay refined and be respectful of the cause, their land, and their culture. Speck tried to talk with Dabble about the mating habits of the summoneers, but all Dabble knew about was some strange correlation between a peculiar organism and an egg that is developed in a laboratory somewhere in the crater. That made Speck even more curious, but he held off on continuing his conversation with Dabble. He sensed that Missy was becoming aloof during the meal, possibly due to his lack of attention toward her. He moved a little closer to Missy and whispered something in her ear that sparked a smile. At an adjacent table, Phil could not get enough of the goo-goo berries and cocoa pods. He inquired, "Do you think I can take some of these home with me, Murph?" The large cause simply tilted his head and raised an eyebrow. Zander replied, "I'm not sure you should ask, Dad." Missy and Brian really seemed to bond during their newly shared experience in Beanland. "I love you, Mom." He leaned over affectionately. Missy smiled warmly at Brian as she put her arm around him and kissed his cheek. Then she glanced lovingly at Speck, but could tell that his mind was elsewhere. She was aware that Speck had an enormous amount of information he was trying to take in, so she suggested that he go near Surma to chat a little more before the end of their visit. Speck nodded his head in agreement, put his hand gently on her shoulder, wiped his mouth, and got up. Just then Surma stood and everyone hushed. When she stepped up onto a wide raised rectangular rock area, Speck walked back to his seat with a disappointed, crooked-lipped look. Then Surma began by saying, "Before we commence with the ceremony, I would like to let our visitors know that the popper in question was found. I will ask you later about the wonderful smell that surrounded it." Zander knew that she was probably talking about the mint-flavored toothpaste that the popper had bounced against in his family bathroom. Surma continued, "It and the surrounding area were scanned and cleared with no negative side effects, so please do not let it worry you. However, not being a resident of your planet, I cannot tell you whether Earth has been contaminated in any way from our popper. Therefore, I recommend that you clean whatever it came into contact with, then properly dispose of any of those items that you can." Zander and Phil looked at each other, then glanced at the others. Phil quietly remarked with insistence, "Your backpack stays here." Surma began droning in a low tone to calm the group. One by one, the other caws hummed along. When there was a communal commitment to listen, Surma announced, "Our loving and gracious Ziron will now come forth to lead us in a heartfelt song of praise and blessings." After they sang, Ziron called all the human visitors to his throne area. The 5 were politely positioned in a line, and then he made a speech. Ziron thanked everyone for being present at the farewell celebration. He also explained that the humans would need to discontinue visits to Beanland. He added, "We have all enjoyed your company, and we are grateful that your presence has given us all hope for improvement. However, in the best interest of our land and yours, I am sure you will all agree that the intermingling of microscopic biochemical influences may disturb the natural order of things. This could disrupt the current planetary peace and health we have all known in our lives. Therefore, the portal will be closed for future entry into Beanland. We must permanently part ways at this juncture. However, we respectfully appreciate your visit here and will be most obliged to you for accommodating our requests. Furthermore, we feel that our fleeting interactions will forever, and for the better, create positivity throughout your planet Earth, thus creating a happier interplanetary vibe." Speck sighed and leaned toward Missy. "This place was going to be my crowning jewel." He continued with an internal dialogue. "I was hoping that my research could blossom in Beanland. I thought I was going to create a document that is universal, that could offer new knowledge based on the discovery of unfamiliar environmental, vegetative, and life form information." He exhaled a discouraged-sounding breath. Missy gently took Speck's hand. Brian noticed and raised his eyebrows and slightly nodded his head with approval. Missy whispered to Speck, "Stay positive." Speck smiled. Meanwhile, Zander couldn't help feeling that he was probably the main reason for the portal closing and for the discontinued visits to Beanland, but he didn't say anything. Zander also felt that he had important work ahead of him back home, which he would figure out somehow, some way. He lowered his head down and nodded in acknowledgement and agreement with Ziron. Ziron announced that they would each be given a special blessing which will aid them in carrying out his or her task. He told Phil, Zander, Brian, Missy, and Speck to turn around and face Surma. She held the hands of each visitor while Ziron said the following. "Speck, You are now asked to continue providing scientific explanations. Foster advancements that earthly beings will be open to. Your focus should be toward natural energy resources. Surma is giving you a special formula to use with the attached blueprints to aid you in the production of hydrocarbon energy. Missy, you are now asked to provide organic developments by teaching others to share hybrid produce for human consumption. You will learn to create bigger and healthier fruits and vegetables. Your focus should be toward organics and antioxidants. Surma is handing you a container of seeds from Beanland. Use them with care and diligence. Instructions for successful gardening are provided inside. Brian, you are now asked to assist in better care for earthly animals. You will promote resources that will educate other human beings to have respect for other species, such as pets, wildlife, and farm animals. You and your mother will teach people how to meditate, have clear thoughts, and become more peaceful. This will help people become more connected with other life forms. Please study, use, and share the kindness chants that you will find on the disc. Phil, you are now asked to act as a leader for your fellow humans, to broaden their ideas about family relations and about coexisting with respect for all beings despite their differences. Try to educate them about incorporating community caregiving services. Beyond this great task will be to focus on obtaining drinking water. Surma is providing you with a small version of a filtration device that can be used to purify salt water. Please have the wherewithal to have it manufactured for use on a much greater scale than is used presently. Zander, you are now asked to be open to gaining new friends. Future friendships will impart the knowledge you will need to gain a world view of peace and cooperation. More importantly, teach people to care about the planet and each other. Surma is providing you with a copy of the SEIM chant, along with something that she calls the CAT. Wear it with the utmost wisdom, so that peace shall prevail. Then Surma walked Zander a few steps away from everyone and whispered to him, "The crystal amulet of truth should always be used wisely and responsibly. It might take time to learn its powers, so protect it always. You will feel and know how and when it should be used. It can aid you immensely in your quest. May harmony shine around your ultimate intention." Next, Zeron made a memorable speech regarding the love and respect that the cause will forever share with their new friends. Missy was teary-eyed. All five kneeled before Zeron and bowed their heads as they thanked their new friend graciously for the last time. Surma handed each of them a written document outlining the requests asked of them. As the five arose, everyone cheered and wished each other wellness and happiness. Hugs and handshakes ensued, and smiles and tears filled many a face. Zander felt overwhelmed inside, like a special miraculous gift had been given to him. He knew he would do his best to fulfill the request that Zeron asked of him, but he was not quite sure what it meant. He had a lot to think about, so he tried his best to save those thoughts for his own space and time. Even though he loved being in Beanland, he felt ready to go home. He knew his mom was worried and waiting, and he was looking forward to giving her a big hug. Chapter 20. Back to Manorville. The time had come for the five travelers to follow Surma through a wooden pocket door that Triad unlocked for them. It smelled like musty dirt, and they could hear dripping water, but they couldn't see very well. They felt the humidity as they followed Surma farther. All five suddenly had an uneasy feeling that Surma must have sensed. "Relax, everyone," she said reassuringly. "I know that it seems a little mysterious in here because there isn't much light, and the air is a little danker. But after we round this next corner, you will see better, and you will notice a special vehicle waiting that will assist in your return home." "Why aren't we going back toward the giant shed?" inquired Zander. Surma replied, "Well, seeing that it is nearing purple time," Speck interrupted. "You need not say more. The zappers, right?" "Yes, Speck," replied Surma. Phil abruptly questioned, "Zappers? What are they? Zander, you never told me about zappers." Zander cringed. "Oh, I didn't?" He was distracted when they turned the corner and he saw the vehicle in front of them. Brian gasped, "Whoa! Way cool!" "I guess it'll be safe, right?" Missy asked. The circular and shiny vehicle was on a platform higher than their heads. There was a round opening to enter it from above. Objects given to them were put aside for a moment, while Surma and two other Kaws held short rods horizontally and moved them up and down around each person, one at a time. They were being cleared, scanned, and sanitized. Any detection of additional items from Beanland would have to be left behind. Zander was the first to be levitated up and into the vehicle. Brian was next, followed by the adults. Speck had a rock and a leaf in his pocket. He also had a bug in a specimen container. He apologized for his lack of knowledge about their restrictions. Missy mumbled facetiously, "I'm surprised that's it," referring to the small amount of samples Speck had. Brian commented about the levitation. "That was the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. I feel older now for some reason." Zander smiled at him with an agreeable nod and sat back comfortably. As they readied themselves for the transport home, Zander had an aha moment. He sat still and silent, eyebrows raised and mouth slightly opened. He was caught up in the celebratory moment earlier, but it had suddenly dawned on him that his request from Zeron was nothing less than a monumental task. What Surma told him really sank in also. What he was being asked to do was mind-boggling to him. "Oh my goodness," he thought to himself, "how am I supposed to teach people around the globe to care about the planet and each other? Who does Zeron think I am? This is absolutely nuts. What the heck? I can barely take care of myself. Oh man, this is completely insane. All right, calm down, breathe. Take it easy. No one is expecting any immediate change. That's right, I'll take it easy. I can meditate. That might help." Zander was lost in his mind temporarily. He heard his name repeating, then snapped out of it. Zander responded, Yeah, what?" Phil placed his hand on Zander's head and remarked, "Let's go home." "Are you ready, Zander?" asked Surma. "Yes, thank you. Ready," he replied. As he looked with reverence at the three Kaws one final time, he thought about the letter he had written to Zeron and left for him to find after he and his group had departed. It was a sincere letter of apology for having ventured on his own through the cave and for going into rooms without permission. Zander also extended a wealth of thanks and love to the Kaws and the others for treating him and his group with kindness and respect. Surma instructed the 5 humans to brace themselves against their seats. Next, the adventurers felt the vehicle spinning. The centrifugal force pressed them against the backs of their upright seats. Missy whirred a high-pitched sound, and Brian giggled as they continued to spin increasingly quickly. In an unexpected instant, the group returned to Manorville, USA. They all landed wobbly on their feet, as if they were gently pushed off of a conveyor belt. They all smiled at one another. Phil and Missy sighed with relief. Speck appeared to be somewhat forlorn, while Brian and Zander chuckled a little from the excitement and the dizziness. Grace ran outside when she heard voices. She grabbed both of Zander's arms and lovingly told him that he would not be portal jumping any longer. Grace smiled and insisted that she needed him to be around the house more often. Zander grabbed both of her arms in return and responded, "You got it." Zander gave his mom a big hug. Phil chuckled with delight as he picked up Cindy and playfully jostled her in his arms. "I missed you, my little mouse," he said. Cindy said, "Great! Did you have a nice hike?" "We sure did," Phil answered. Missy smiled and grabbed her backpack. "We can get together later to chat, but now I think we need to go home and clean up. Besides, I just want to sit with my feet up for a little while." They all agreed. Missy invited Speck to go along with her and Brian. He accepted. Zander and Phil got right to work on disinfecting the bathroom and throwing away the toothbrushes, the hand soap, and any other items that weren't a permanent fixture. Grace was a little taken aback by their disapproval of her cleaning abilities at first, but she clearly understood when they explained. She helped by disinfecting the cat carrier outside and then double-bagged it and the various bathroom items for trash pickup. Cindy helped by popping some microwavable popcorn. While sitting as a family and watching the evening news on television, Zander felt a heightened sensitivity. His anxiety about the world was stronger than before, possibly because of the immense sense of peace he had experienced while in Beanland. This awareness of sensitive feelings engaged another memory about the psychic speaking about gaining a new view. Suddenly he felt connected to his thoughts in a way that he hadn't ever before. "How about watching funny animal clips instead?" he proposed. Grace agreed. "Sure. They always make me smile. Good idea." Later that evening, near the usual bedtime, Brian, Missy, and Speck joined the Harmons on their patio. Zander felt glad to be part of the adult conversation. The crickets were noisy. The nighttime air was cool and crisp. Everything seemed right. For a moment, everyone seemed to appreciate their lives and their time together. With awareness of breaths, Buddhist-like smiles, and a look of satisfaction in their eyes, the 5 adventurers were content to be just where they were. Cindy must have sensed the mood of the moment, too, because while she was sitting on Zander's lap, she turned and put her arms around Zander's neck. "I love you, big brother." "I love you, too," he said. "Aww," Grace expressed with pride. She couldn't help but respond to her children's affection for each other. Then the rest of them joined in with a collective, "Aww." They all laughed light-heartedly together, then gazed up at the twinkling stars for a little while.